She gave him 5 years. He gave her a public goodbye in a hotel lobby, while his new woman stood 3 feet away in a dress that cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. 5 years of early mornings, skipped vacations, covered shifts, and swallowed pride. And Ethan Mercer handed all of it back in a single sentence without even lowering his voice. If you've ever built someone else's dreams so carefully that you forgot to keep anything for yourself, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Okay, the rain came down like it had a grudge. Clara Ashford stood outside the Meridian Hotel on West 54th Street with her coat half buttoned and her hair already plastered flat against her forehead, and she wasn't moving because her legs had stopped working the way legs are supposed to. She could feel the water soaking through her shoes. She could feel the cold pushing up through the soles and into her ankles and climbing her shins, but she couldn't make herself step under the awning because stepping under the awning meant accepting that what had just happened inside that lobby had actually happened. She'd been in there 40 minutes ago. She'd worn the green dress she bought 9 months back for a dinner they never ended up going to. She'd done her hair. She'd taken the crosstown bus because she wanted to surprise him, because Ethan had been distant for 3 weeks, and she'd decided tonight was the night she'd stop waiting for him to close the gap, and she would close it herself. She'd walked through those glass doors with her stomach full of nervous optimism and found him standing near the bar with his hand resting on the lower back of a woman Clara had seen exactly once before, in a photograph on the society page of a magazine she'd been flipping through in a waiting room. Celeste Beaumont, 28, daughter of Harlan Beaumont of Beaumont Capital. Photographed at every gala worth attending in the greater New York area for the last 4 years. Hair the color of expensive caramel. A smile that knew it was being watched. Clara had stopped walking. Ethan had seen her. She'd watched the recognition move across his face. Not guilt, not fear, something closer to inconvenience. And he'd said something to Celeste, something short, something that made Celeste glance over with the particular calibrated expression of a woman who had known about Clara long before this moment. Then he'd walked over. Clara. That was how he started it, just her name. No apology in the syllables, no warmth, like reading a label. "What's going on?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "I should have done this differently." He looked at the floor for half a second and then back up at her. "I've been trying to find a way to... Who is she?" "Her name is Celeste. It's been a few months." He said it the way someone admits to a parking ticket. Minor, administrative, already half resolved. Clara felt her face go very still. She was aware of the bartender pretending not to listen. She was aware of a couple at the nearest table who had gone quiet. "A few months," she said. "I know this is hard." "You've been with someone else for a few months." "Clara, while I was..." She stopped. While she was what, exactly? While she was editing his briefs at midnight. While she was fielding calls from his difficult clients, because he said she was better with people than he was. While she was declining invitations from the 2 friends she still had because Ethan always needed something on weekends. She couldn't finish the sentence. Not because she didn't know what came after it, but because the full weight of it had just arrived and her chest didn't have room. "You deserve someone who's fully present," he said. He'd prepared that line. She could tell by how cleanly it came out. "I haven't been fair to you, I know that." "Don't." She said it quietly. "I genuinely care about you." Ethan. Her voice was flat. "Stop talking." He stopped. He looked at her with something that might have been pity if she'd been willing to name it that, and then he put his hand briefly on her arm. A single, weightless touch, the kind you give someone you're excusing yourself from. And he walked back to Celeste Beaumont, and he didn't look over his shoulder. Clara stood there for 6 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. Then she walked out through the glass doors and into the rain, and her legs stopped working properly about 20 feet down the sidewalk, and that was where she'd been standing ever since. She didn't cry. That surprised her. She'd expected crying. Instead, there was just this enormous hollow pressure behind her sternum, the feeling of something structural giving way like a beam pulled out of a building. The building was still standing, but it was wrong now. The angles were wrong. A cab went through a puddle at the curb and the water hit the back of her calves, and still she didn't move. She was 31 years old. She had a graduate degree in library science and a position at the Harwick Public Library on Amsterdam Avenue that she loved genuinely and that paid her approximately nothing. She had a one-bedroom apartment in Washington Heights that cost 60% of her take-home because Manhattan was a city designed to grind people like her into paste. She had given the last 5 years of her life, her actual life, not some peripheral portion of it, but the center of it, the years that were supposed to matter, to a man who had just walked back to another woman without looking over his shoulder. She didn't know how long she stood there before she reached into her coat pocket for her phone. She wasn't sure who she intended to call. Her friend Dana was in Portland for a work thing. Her friend Marcus would pick up, but he would say all the right things in the wrong order, and she would end up comforting him for worrying about her. She stood with her thumb hovering over the screen while the rain hit it and the drops distorted the icons. Then she saw the contact. She hadn't put it there. She knew with absolute certainty that she had never typed that name into her phone. She knew her own contacts the way you know the contents of your own refrigerator, instinctively, spatially, without having to look directly at them. And this was not one of them. The name read, "Call this number when you have nothing left." EA, her mother's initials. Eleanor Ashford, dead 14 months. Clara stood in the rain and looked at the contact and felt the hollow pressure behind her sternum turn into something colder and sharper and harder to name. Her mother had been a librarian too, quiet woman, organized, wore cardigans, made soup from scratch on Sundays, had died of a cardiac event in her sleep on a Tuesday in May, and had left Clara a 2-room apartment full of books, a modest savings account, and no explanation whatsoever for the fact that she had apparently, at some point before dying, put a contact into her daughter's phone for exactly this moment. Clara pressed call. It rang twice. "Ms. Ashford." The voice on the other end was male, composed, with an accent she couldn't immediately place, something European, something clipped and precise. "I've been waiting for this call." She almost hung up. "Who is this?" "My name is Adrian Viscari. I work for an organization that belonged to your mother. I should say, that belongs to you now. I can explain everything, but not over the phone." A pause. "Are you somewhere safe?" Clara looked up and down West 54th Street. Rain, yellow cabs, a couple running for a doorway with a jacket over their heads. "I'm standing in the rain outside a hotel," she said. "My boyfriend just left me for someone else." A beat of silence. Not uncomfortable. More like someone absorbing information and cataloging it. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it the way people say things they actually mean rather than things they feel obligated to say. "That sounds like a very bad night." "Yeah," she said, "it's a bad night. There's a car 2 blocks east of your position. Black sedan, license plate ending in 774. The driver's name is Marco. He'll bring you somewhere warm and dry, and I'll answer every question you have. You're under no obligation to stay." Another pause. "But Ms. Ashford, there are things you need to know. Things your mother should have told you herself and didn't." Clara's hand tightened around the phone. The rain was getting heavier. She could feel it running down the back of her neck inside her collar. "Things about what?" she said. "About who you actually are," Adrian Viscari said, "and about what you've just inherited." She found the car. It was exactly where he said it would be. The driver, Marco, was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where sudden movements got people killed. He didn't speak when she got in. He handed her a folded towel from the seat beside him and pulled into traffic without asking where she wanted to go, because he already knew. They drove for 22 minutes. Clara tracked the route out of habit, the FDR south across the bridge, through Brooklyn streets that got quieter and less familiar as they went. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window, and she did not ask Marco any questions because something in his bearing made it clear that Marco's role in this situation was to drive, and that was the entirety of his role. The car stopped in front of a building in Cobble Hill that looked like a converted warehouse from the outside. Brick face, no signage, windows that were either dark or frosted from the street. Marco got out and held the door. Clara looked at the building for 3 seconds and then got out. The inside was different from the outside in a way that took her a moment to process. The ground floor was open, high-ceilinged, with exposed steel beams that had been cleaned and painted rather than removed. The furniture was expensive in the way that doesn't announce itself. Muted fabrics, clean lines, lighting that suggested deliberate choices rather than an electrician with a catalog. There were 4 people visible in the space, each doing something at a screen or a table, each of whom glanced at Clara when she entered and then returned to what they were doing with the kind of practiced neutrality that meant they'd been told she was coming and told not to react. Ms. Ashford. The man who came down the stairs from the mezzanine level was not what she'd expected from the voice, and she realized afterward that she'd made the mistake of building a picture in her head during the drive. She'd been expecting someone older, gray, soft around the middle with hard eyes, the kind of man her mother might have known. Adrian Vescari was in his late 30s. He moved the way people move when they've been trained to move that way, economical, balanced, aware of the space around him. He was dark-featured, with a jaw that looked like it had been introduced to a fist at least once, and he had the kind of eyes that didn't give you a lot but didn't take anything away either. He was wearing a dark jacket over a dark shirt, no tie, and he carried himself with the particular gravity of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. He stopped 6 feet from her and held her gaze without aggression and without deference. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You didn't have to." "The phone number in my phone says otherwise," Clara said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Fair," he said. "Come sit down." He led her to a seating area near the far wall, a low table, 2 chairs angled toward each other, a cup of coffee that had clearly been made recently and placed there in anticipation of her arrival. She sat. He sat across from her. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her steadily. "Your mother's name was Eleanor Ashford," he began. "Born Eleanor Montclair in 1961 in Lyon, France. She came to the United States in 1989. She met your father, Thomas Ashford, in New York in 1990, married him in 1991, and had you in 1993. Thomas Ashford died in a car accident in 1997 when you were 4 years old." He paused. "How much of that do you know?" "All of it," Clara said. "She told me about my father, not much, but she told me what she knew." "What she told you was accurate," Adrian said. "What she didn't tell you was what she was doing before she married him, and what she returned to after he died." Clara looked at her coffee but didn't touch it. "What was she doing?" "Running," he said. For most of the 70s and 80s, Eleanor Montclair was the operational intelligence director of an organization called the Ashmont Syndicate. Her father, your maternal grandfather, Edouard Montclair, built it from the ground up starting in the late 1950s. By the time Eleanor was 30, it was the primary financial and enforcement network operating across New York, Amsterdam, and 3 cities in northern Italy. He let that sit for a moment. When she left to marry your father, she gave control of the organization to a trust administered by her most senior lieutenants, with the condition that it reverted to her, or to her designated heir, upon her death. The hollow pressure in Clara's chest had not gone away. It had been rearranged. She was running a criminal organization, Clara said. Among other things, the Ashmont Syndicate has legitimate holdings: real estate, private equity, a shipping concern in Rotterdam. The less legitimate portions handle enforcement contracts, intelligence brokerage, and controlled financial operations in markets where legitimate banking doesn't reach. He kept his voice even. He was watching her carefully but not urgently, the way you watch something fragile that you're not sure has registered the danger it's in. Your mother stepped away from it entirely when she came to the States. She built a different life. She wanted a different life for you. But she put that contact in my phone. She put it there 3 years ago, Adrian said. She told me, and I spoke with her directly, 4 times in the year before she died, that she prayed you'd never need to use it. But she said she knew you well enough to know that if the day came when you had nothing left, you would be exactly the kind of woman who could handle what came with it. Clara sat with that. She looked at the coffee again. She picked it up this time and drank from it, not because she wanted it, but because she needed something to do with her hands that wasn't betraying how badly they wanted to shake. "What does handling it look like?" she said. It looks like you assuming your position as the controlling heir of the Ashmont Syndicate, Adrian said. Full authority over all holdings, all operations, and all personnel, including me. He held her gaze. I've served this organization for 11 years. I was Eleanor's choice for chief strategist 3 years before she died. I pledged my loyalty to the succession, which means I pledged it to you, whatever you decide. He paused. I won't pretend this isn't complicated. I won't pretend there isn't danger. But I will tell you that the organization is structurally sound, that your mother's lieutenants are loyal, and that the transition, handled correctly, can be clean. And if I say no, Clara said. Then Marco drives you home, Adrian said. And the trust reverts to a contingency arrangement your mother specified. The organization doesn't collapse, it continues. He paused. But it won't be yours. Clara set the coffee down. She stared at the table between them and ran a calculation that she couldn't have described in steps. Something faster than logic, something underneath it, in the place where the hollow pressure lived. She thought about Ethan Mercer walking back to Celeste Beaumont without looking over his shoulder. She thought about the green dress she'd bought 9 months ago for a dinner they never went to. She thought about her mother in her cardigan on Sunday mornings making soup from scratch, and she tried to fit the woman in the cardigan into the information Adrian Viscari had just given her. And she couldn't do it completely, but she could do it enough. Because she knew her mother. Not perfectly. But well enough to know that Eleanor Ashford had been a woman who survived things, and that the survival had come from somewhere, and that she had spent Clara's entire childhood making sure Clara would survive too, even if she never explained why it mattered so much. Tell me about the organization, Clara said. Adrian Viscari looked at her for a moment, just a moment, and she saw something move behind his eyes that she didn't have a name for yet. All right, he said, and leaned back in his chair and began to talk. He talked for 3 hours. He walked her through the structure of the Ashmont Syndicate the way a surgeon describes an anatomy. Precisely, without euphemism, without softening the parts that needed to be heard clearly. He told her about the legitimate holdings first, the real estate portfolio spanning commercial properties in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and a block of mixed-use buildings in Amsterdam's Canal District. He told her about the private equity arm, which was clean enough to pass any audit and generated returns that made the entire organization's less legitimate income look like pocket change. He told her about the shipping concern in Rotterdam, which was both exactly what it said it was and also, under the right circumstances, useful for other purposes. He did not soften the other purposes. He described the enforcement contracts with the flat precision of someone who had spent too long in the business of reality to confuse describing something with endorsing it. He told her about the intelligence brokerage, which he called the organization's most valuable and most dangerous asset, a network of information sources embedded in financial institutions, law enforcement, municipal government, and the upper social tier of New York and several European cities. He told her about 3 rival organizations operating in overlapping territory, one of which had been probing for weaknesses since Eleanor's death 14 months ago. Clara listened without interrupting. She had a librarian's ear for structure and sequence, and she used it now, building a mental architecture of what she was hearing and flagging the parts she'd need to return to. Her coffee went cold. She didn't notice. When he finished, the room had settled into the deep quiet of very late at night, and Clara's head was full in a way it hadn't been in years. Not the anxious clutter of a bad day, but something more like the feeling of lifting something heavy and discovering she could. The organization's been running without a principal authority for 14 months, she said. Managed by the trust. Managed well, but there are decisions that require an authority. Contracts that need a signature with weight behind it. Challenges that need a response with consequence. He looked at her steadily. Your absence has been noted by people who are watching for weakness. The rival you mention, the one probing since my mother died. The Cressida Group, Adrian said. Eastern European interests, New York-based since 2015. They've been quiet recently, which concerns me more than noise would. You think they're preparing something. I think they're waiting to see who sits down, Adrian said. If no one does, or if the wrong person does, they'll stop waiting. Clara was quiet for a moment, then, You said you pledged loyalty to me. What does that actually mean in practice? Adrian Viscari looked at her with those steady, unrevealing eyes and said, It means that if someone tried to hurt you right now, They would not get a second opportunity. It means that every resource this organization has, financial, informational, operational, is available to you on your instruction. It means I'll tell you things you don't want to hear when you need to hear them, and I'll execute whatever you decide with complete precision. A beat. It doesn't mean I'll agree with everything you decide, but it means I'll be honest about that disagreement and then do what you say. Clara nodded slowly. That's a more useful definition of loyalty than I'm used to, she said. The corner of his mouth did the thing again. Almost a smile. Your mother said something similar when we first met, he said. She sat with that. She sat with all of it. The rain-soaked dress she was still wearing, the hollow pressure that had shifted into something harder and more useful. The 3 hours of information rearranging itself in her head into something like a map. She sat with the image of her mother in a Lyon library in 1979, 22 years old, running the intelligence operation of a criminal empire that stretched from New York to Amsterdam, and somehow being the same woman who made soup on Sundays and picked Clara up from school and read her to sleep until she was 11 years old and started insisting she was too old for it. She had not been a nobody's daughter. She had been this. Okay, Clara said. Adrian looked at her. I'm not saying yes to everything tonight, she said. I'm not saying yes to anything I haven't understood, but I'm not saying no either. She held his gaze. First thing tomorrow, I want to meet the trust administrators. All of them, together, in the same room. I want to see the financial records for the last 14 months, and I want a full dossier on the Cressida Group. Everything you have, not a summary. That can be arranged by 8 in the morning, Adrian said. Good. She stood up. The dress was still damp. Her shoes were ruined. She felt steadier than she had any right to feel, standing in a converted warehouse in Cobble Hill at 2 in the morning, having just been told her dead mother was a crime lord. She looked at Adrian Viscari, who had also stood, who was watching her with that expression she couldn't fully read. One more thing, she said. Yes. The man who left me tonight, Ethan Mercer. He's a corporate attorney at Delworth and Cross in Midtown. I want to know everything there is to know about him, everything that isn't clean. Adrian held her gaze for a beat. I'll have something for you by morning, he said. Thank you, Clara said. She moved toward the door. She stopped without turning around. Adrian? Ms. Ashford. My mother trusted you, she said. That means something to me, but I don't know you yet. She paused. So don't give me a reason to find out what you look like when I don't. The silence behind her had a quality to it. Not tension, exactly. More like the sound of someone recalibrating their assessment of a person they thought they'd already assessed. She didn't wait for him to answer. She walked to the door and Marco materialized from somewhere to open it, and the night air hit her, and it was still raining but softer now, barely a mist, and she breathed it in and walked to the car. She did not look back at the building. She sat in the back seat and watched Brooklyn move past the windows, and she kept her hands in her lap and she breathed slow and even, and she thought about her mother's handwriting on those Sunday notes tucked into her lunch bags in 4th grade, the looping, careful cursive, and she thought about Adrian Viscari's voice on the phone in the rain. There are things you need to know about who you actually are. She was almost back to the bridge when her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, no name, no greeting, just 4 words. The Cressida Group moved tonight. Clara read the message 3 times. The car was on the bridge now, the East River black and wide below, Manhattan's lights stacking up against the dark sky like something that didn't know it was supposed to be humble. Marco was driving with both hands on the wheel and the particular stillness of a man who had learned not to react to things happening in the back seat. She called Adrian. He picked up before the second ring. I know, he said. Tell me what that means. Move tonight. What does that mean specifically? It means they hit one of our warehouses in Red Hook 40 minutes ago. Storage and transit facility. Nobody was inside. We got a tip 20 minutes before it happened. A pause. The tip came from inside. The car came off the bridge and turned south. Clara kept her eyes forward. Someone warned you. Someone warned us, yes. Which means someone inside the Cressida Group has a reason to keep us intact. Or a reason to keep themselves positioned favorably with whatever comes next. His voice was even, too even. She was starting to understand that evenness was his tell, not for calm, but for the particular focused energy of a man doing several things at once. I'm already at the scene. I'll come to you. Ms. Ashford, I'll come to you, she said again. Marco knows where it is? Marco's eyes in the rearview mirror said yes before he could. All right, Adrian said. He didn't argue. She noted that. The Red Hook facility was a ground floor unit in a block of industrial spaces near the waterfront, the kind of address that didn't appear on any consumer map, and whose neighbors were the sort of businesses that operated late and asked no questions. By the time Marco pulled up, there were 3 other cars already there, and the smell of accelerant hung in the cold air like a warning that hadn't quite finished delivering itself. The fire had been small, contained to the front third of the building, put out fast. But the intent had been clear. This wasn't about destroying inventory. It was about sending a message to a room they weren't sure yet was occupied. Adrian met her at the door. He'd changed his jacket. This one was darker, and there was something careful in the way he'd positioned himself between her and the interior of the building that she didn't think was accidental. Walk me through it, she said. He walked her through it. 2 men on the exterior. Cressida contractors, not principals. The kind of hired labor that got used when you wanted deniability. They'd used an accelerant on the front entrance and a timed igniter, which was efficient but not sophisticated. This wasn't their best work, Adrian said, moving through the space with a flashlight, the smoke-blackened walls catching the beam and throwing it back gray and ugly. Which is interesting. They wanted us to see it coming, Claire said, or they wanted someone to see it coming. He stopped near a section of wall that had been less damaged than the rest. There was a mark on it, not from the fire, something older, a painted symbol she didn't recognize. We've had that symbol since 1987, Adrian said. Ashmont designation. Every facility carries it. He looked at her. The Cressida people knew exactly which wall to avoid. Clara looked at the symbol, then she looked at Adrian. Someone told them which wall. Yes. And the same someone tipped you that the attack was coming. That's my read. She was quiet for a moment. The smell of the accelerant was getting into the back of her throat. So we have someone inside this organization who's been talking to Cressida and also doesn't want us destroyed, which means they want something, a position, a deal. She paused. Or they're playing both sides because they don't know yet which side is going to win. Adrian held her gaze. That's my read too, he said. Who knew about this facility? 14 people. Trust administrators, operational leads, and 2 courier contacts. He said it without hesitation, which meant he'd already run the list before she asked. I've narrowed it to 4 based on access and timing. Tell me their names in the morning, she said, after I've met the trust administrators. I want to see their faces when I walk in the room before I know which ones are suspects. He looked at her for a moment. That's a sound instinct, he said. I've spent 5 years reading people who were lying to me, she said. I got good at it eventually. She turned and walked back toward the door. Is there anything salvageable here? The inventory was minimal. It was mostly a transit point. Then secure it, document everything, and get me those 4 names by 7:30. She stepped outside into the night air, which was cleaner but not clean. And find out who sent me that text. The tip didn't come to you first, it came to me. Someone wanted me to know they had access to my number. She saw it register on his face. That he hadn't clocked that detail yet, or had and hadn't had time to work it. I'll find out, he said. I know you will, she said, and got back in the car. She did not sleep. She sat at the small desk in the Washington Heights apartment she'd lived in for 4 years, and she looked at the wall above the desk where she'd tacked a map of Manhattan some time back for no particular reason. And she started building a new map in her head, one that didn't have streets on it but had names and positions and vectors of interest. The kind of map a librarian builds when she's trying to understand a system she's never encountered before. She made coffee at 4 in the morning. She changed out of the green dress finally, folded it, put it in the bottom of a drawer. She didn't throw it away. She wasn't sure why. At 6:45, Marco was outside. The building Adrian used for the trust meeting was different from the Cobble Hill warehouse, a townhouse in the West Village, slim and unremarkable from the outside. The kind of address that appeared in property records under a holding company with an opaque name and an Amsterdam mailing address. The ground floor had been arranged as a conference space, A long table, 8 chairs, water glasses already filled, morning light coming through frosted windows in pale horizontal strips. 6 people were already seated when Clara walked in. Adrian was standing at the far end of the table, not seated, positioned at the edge of the room the way a man positions himself when he wants to be able to see everyone without being part of the group. He introduced her without ceremony. "Clara Ashford," he said, "Eleanor's daughter, the principal heir." They looked at her. 6 people who had been managing a criminal financial empire for 14 months in the absence of its rightful authority, and not one of them had expected her to look like this. The librarian posture, the unremarkable face, the dark circles from a sleepless night. She could feel them cataloging her and finding her smaller than anticipated, and she used that. She let them look. She pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down and put her hands flat on the table and looked at each of them in turn, slowly, with the unhurried attention of someone who has all morning. "I'm not going to introduce myself," she said. "You know who I am. What I want from this meeting is simple. I want each of you to tell me, in one sentence, what the organization needs most right now. Not what you've been doing, what it needs." She looked down the table. "We'll start on my left." The man on her left was named Dorian Voss, 50-something, silver-haired, with the expensive grooming of someone who had been making serious money for a long time. He had the specific quality of stillness that powerful men develop when they've spent decades in rooms where stillness reads as authority. He looked at her and said, "It needs a principal authority who can sign off on the Rotterdam renegotiation before the end of the month, or we lose the contract." Clara nodded. She moved to the next. The woman across from Voss was Petra Sandel, younger, late 30s, dark-eyed, and precise in her movements. "It needs an answer for the Cressida situation," Petra said. "Last night wasn't the first probe. It was the 5th. Clara kept her face still. That was new information. "The 5th, she said. "In 8 months, Petra said. "The previous 4 were minor. Information testing, boundary testing. Last night was different." "Yes, it was," Clara said. She looked at Adrian. He was watching Petra with an expression that told her he'd known about the previous 4 incidents and had not yet determined whether Petra's volunteering this information in front of everyone was signal or noise. Clara filed that. She moved on around the table. The other 4 administrators gave her staffing issues in the Amsterdam operation, a pending legal exposure in a subsidiary real estate deal, the need for a clear succession protocol to be filed with the organization's legal structure, and a request for clarity on operational authority boundaries during the transition period. When they'd all spoken, she was quiet for 10 seconds, long enough for it to settle. "Dorian," she said, "the Rotterdam contract, what are the specific sticking points?" Voss looked mildly surprised that she'd come back to him first. He described the renegotiation, a shipping rate dispute with a third-party logistics firm that the Rotterdam operation relied on, complicated by a clause in the original contract that required principal authority. Signature for any amendment above a certain financial threshold. Clara asked 3 questions. Voss answered them. She told him she'd review the contract documents by end of day and give him an answer by tomorrow morning. "Petra," she said, "tell me about the previous 4 incidents." Petra told her. She was precise and unembellished, which Clara appreciated, and she had specifics: dates, locations, what was tested, what the response had been. Clara listened with the same ear she used for research, building a timeline, flagging the inconsistencies. There was a gap in the 3rd incident's documentation. She noted it without mentioning it. When Petra finished, Clara said, "Who manages the organization's internal communications security?" Silence. The 6 administrators exchanged glances, not dramatically, but enough. It was the kind of glance that passes between people who share a piece of information and are figuring out in real time who's going to volunteer it. "That responsibility sits with operational security," Dorian Voss said carefully, "which has historically reported to the chief strategist." He looked at Adrian. Adrian didn't look away from Clara. "Correct," he said. "I've had concerns about our current protocols for approximately 6 months. I raised them with the trust. The trust position was that changes to security infrastructure required principal authority approval. A beat. Which we didn't have." Clara looked at the table. She looked at the 6 administrators. So for 6 months, she said, the organization has been running with security protocols that your chief strategist believed were compromised, and the trust's response was to wait for someone who wasn't here yet. Nobody answered that directly. Nobody needed to. All right, Clara said. She looked at Adrian. Fix it. Full authorization, starting today. Whatever you need. She looked back at the table. The rest of you? I'm going to need 48 hours to read through the documentation Adrian's pulling for me. During that time, nothing moves without running through him first. When I come back to this table, I'll be ready to take operational authority in full. She pushed her chair back but didn't stand yet. One more thing. Someone in this organization talked to the Cressida group about our Red Hook facility. That conversation happened within the last 3 months. I'm going to find out who it was. She looked at each face in turn, unhurried, the same way she'd looked at them when she walked in. I want that person to know that I'm not my mother in the sense that I haven't yet learned where I prefer to draw certain lines. I'm still figuring out how far I'm willing to go. She stood. That uncertainty should be more frightening to them than certainty would be. She left the room. Adrian caught up with her in the hallway. The 4 names, he said quietly, handing her a folded paper. She opened it, read it. One of them was Dorian Voss. Another was the administrator who'd raised the staffing issue in Amsterdam, a man named Cole, who'd had his eyes slightly too still during the meeting, the way eyes go still when someone's concentrating very hard on appearing relaxed. She refolded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. And the text message, she said. Who sent it? Burner phone. Purchased in cash in Queens 3 days ago. 1 outgoing message. Yours. He paused. But the number that activated the SIM was registered through a relay we recognize. It's associated with a broker we've used before, someone named Lena Marsh. She runs information independently. No organizational affiliation, sells to whoever pays. She sold to Cressida at least twice that we know of. And now she's selling to me, Clara said. She's selling to the Ashmont heir, Adrian said. She doesn't know you yet. She's positioning. Find her, Clara said. Don't approach her yet. I want to know her habits, her contacts, her pressure points. She started moving toward the door. I want the Ethan Mercer file, too. You said by morning. It's in the car, he said. The file was a standard manila folder, thin but not empty. Marco handed it to her when she got in, and she opened it before the car pulled away from the curb. It was thorough in the way that only happens when the person doing the research has access to things that don't appear in public records. Ethan Mercer, 34, associate attorney at Delworth and Cross, specializing in corporate compliance, graduate of Columbia Law, top third of his class, not top 10th, which was the part he'd always glossed over when he told the story. 3 years ago, he'd been passed over for a fast-track promotion and responded by opening a side consulting arrangement with a financial services firm called Novian Partners, which was not technically prohibited by his employment agreement, but occupied a gray area that his firm would not have approved of had they known. Novian Partners, Clara noted, had received a regulatory inquiry from the SEC 14 months ago. The inquiry had been quietly closed. The file noted, without elaboration, that the closure had been facilitated by a document that should not have existed, originating from a sealed compliance review at a firm that Delworth and Cross represented. Ethan had given a client sealed documents to a firm under regulatory investigation. That wasn't gray. That was the end of a legal career if it surfaced. Clara closed the folder. She looked out the window at the West Village streets, the morning foot traffic, the normal city doing its normal thing with no idea. He doesn't know we have this, she said. No, Adrian said from the front seat. He'd taken the passenger seat for this leg. And the SEC inquiry was closed quietly enough that his firm doesn't know either. How long have you had it? A pause. The information about Novian has been in our files for about 8 months. It wasn't connected to your name at the time. It came in through our financial intelligence network as a matter of general interest. Another pause. I made the connection this morning. Clara looked at the back of his head. 8 months ago, the Cressida Group was beginning their probing operations against us, she said. Yes. And Novian Partners is a subsidiary holding of the Beaumont Capital portfolio, Adrian said. Harlan Beaumont's investment arm. He said it without inflection, but the information hit the car like a change in air pressure. Clara sat with it. Celeste Beaumont, Ethan Mercer, Harlan Beaumont, Novian Partners, an SEC inquiry that got closed by a document it shouldn't have had. She turned it in her head, fitting the edges together, and what came out was not what she'd expected when she'd woken up that morning. Ethan didn't just leave me for a rich woman, she said. Probably not, Adrian said. He's been embedded in the Beaumont financial network for at least 8 months. That's what the documents suggest. And the Beaumont Capital portfolio, does it overlap with Cressida? The silence that followed was a fraction too long. I need to run that, Adrian said. Run it, she said. She was back at the Washington Heights apartment by noon. She spread the documents Adrian had sent digitally across her laptop screen, the Rotterdam contract, the previous 4 Cressida incident reports, the financial summaries for the organization's legitimate holdings, and she worked through them with the focused, unglamorous attention of someone who had spent her professional life understanding dense systems of information. She made notes, she flagged things. She built the map in her head into something more structured, more usable. At 3:15, Adrian called. Beaumont Capital has a holding in a Luxembourg fund, he said. The fund has a minority position in a logistics company based in Riga. That company contracts with a cargo brokerage in Rotterdam. He paused. The cargo brokerage has historically been used by the Cressida Group for transit. So the Beaumont family is financially connected to the people attacking us, Clara said. Indirectly, but connected. And Ethan Mercer is connected to the Beaumonts. Through Novian, yes. Ethan knew who I was, Clara said. It came out quieter than she intended. She stopped. She said it again, not quietly. Ethan knew who I was. He was with me for 5 years. Either he found out partway through, or someone sent him to me. She let that sit in the air for a moment. Find out which. The gala was a different problem, and it arrived the following morning in the form of an invitation that appeared to have been hand-delivered overnight. A thick cream envelope addressed to Ms. Clara Ashford in a typeface that cost money. The Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala, 2 nights hence, at the Grand Halloran on Park Avenue. Black tie. The Whitmore Foundation, Clara found in 30 minutes of research, was a philanthropic front with board members drawn from the top tier of New York's financial and legal communities. Delworth and Cross sent attorneys every year. The Beaumont family sponsored a table. She brought the invitation to Adrian in the Cobble Hill building, mid-afternoon, and set it on the table between them. He looked at it, looked at her. You want to go, he said. Ethan will be there, she said. Celeste will be there. Harlan Beaumont will be there. Half the financial network this organization needs to operate cleanly in New York will be in one room. She paused. And right now, none of them know what I am. They still think I'm the woman from the hotel lobby in the rain. And you want to change that. I want to change it in a way that they can't recover from, she said. In public. In front of people whose opinion they need. She looked at him. I need to look like what I am, not what I was. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll make some calls, he said. What followed was 2 days that moved faster than anything Clara had experienced in the compressed drama of the last 48 hours. Adrian's network proved to have a reach she hadn't fully understood from his description of it. Stylists who understood the specific visual language of New York's upper tier, a jeweler who moved quickly and without paperwork, a car and driver that was not Marco but was clearly from the same world Marco lived in, smoother, more accustomed to event arrivals. Clara submitted to all of it with the pragmatic, unsentimental attitude of someone who understood that appearance was a form of leverage, and leverage was the point. She also, in those 2 days, read the entire Rotterdam contract, approved a revised terms framework that Dorian Voss called the most aggressive renegotiation position he'd seen in 20 years, and identified the documentation gap in Petra Sandel's incident report on Cressida's third probe. When she brought the gap to Adrian, he looked at it for 10 seconds and said, Petra's been running a separate line to someone in the Cressida network. Not hostile. Informational exchange. She thinks she's been managing a source. I think she's been managed. Is she the leak? Partial leak, probably unaware of the full scope of what she's given them. Does she know about the tip that came to my phone? No. Keep it that way, Clara said. I want to use her. She has a line to Cressida that's valuable if it runs in the right direction. The night of the gala, Clara stood in front of the mirror in a dressing room in the Cobble Hill building. They'd moved certain operations there, and a room had been prepared for her use without her asking, and looked at herself with the dispassionate eye of someone evaluating a problem. The dress was deep midnight blue, structured at the shoulder, falling clean and uncomplicated to the floor. The jewelry was minimal and cost more than her annual salary. Her hair was up in a way that showed her neck and her jaw. The lines that had always been sharper than her soft librarian posture had led people to notice. She looked, she thought, like a woman who had been underestimated for a long time and had decided to stop accommodating it. Adrian appeared in the doorway. He was in black tie, and he wore it the way he wore everything, like it was functional rather than decorative, which somehow made it more effective. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Well, he said. Don't, she said, but without heat. I was going to say you look exactly like your mother did at your age, he said. I've seen photographs. She turned away from the mirror. Let's go, she said. The Grand Halloran was everything its name promised. A pre-war building on Park Avenue with an atrium that had been designed to make everyone who entered it feel smaller than they were, all marble in height and soft lighting that fell like approval from above. The Whitmore Foundation had dressed it with flowers that cost as much as some people's mortgages, and the assembled guests were the precise cross-section of New York's financial and legal elite that Clara had expected. Men in suits whose cut communicated things that price tags didn't, women in gowns that moved with the assurance of serious money, the whole room organized by an invisible social grammar that everyone present had been studying since childhood. Clara walked in with Adrian 2 steps to her left and slightly behind, which was not where an escort typically walked, and which communicated to anyone paying attention that he was not an escort. She saw Ethan before he saw her. He was near the far bar with a group of what appeared to be partners from Delworth and Cross, gesturing in the animated way he got when he was performing for people he needed to impress. He'd had his hair cut recently. He was wearing a watch she'd never seen before, which she suspected was Celeste's suggestion. He looked, she thought, like a man who had recently upgraded his life and was still getting used to it. Celeste was beside him. The caramel hair, the practiced smile, one hand resting on Ethan's arm with the proprietary ease of a woman who had decided on a possession and taken it. She was talking to a woman in red whom Clara didn't recognize. Harlan Beaumont was across the room with 2 other men whose faces Clara had learned from the financial documents. A city councilman with investments that didn't survive scrutiny, and a hedge fund operator who had testified before a Senate subcommittee 3 years ago and emerged slightly cleaner than he'd entered, which was suspicious in its own way. Beaumont was 70, built like a man who'd been physically imposing at 40 and hadn't fully accepted the revision, with the confident posture of someone who had never seriously been told no. Clara did not go toward any of them. She moved through the room with the unhurried patience of someone who understood that rooms like this were about positioning, and that the best position was the one everyone else came to. She accepted a glass of sparkling water. Not champagne, she needed everything tonight. And she talked to a woman from the city's largest independent real estate investment trust, who turned out to be sharper and more interesting than the room gave her credit for, and who looked at Clara with the particular alert attention of someone who was recalibrating an impression in real time. She felt the moment Ethan saw her. She didn't look at him immediately. She finished her sentence to the real estate woman, laughed briefly at something the woman said, and then let her gaze move across the room in the natural way a gaze moves at a party, when it's not looking for anything in particular. He was staring. The group around him had kept talking, but he'd gone slightly absent from it, his eyes locked on her with an expression that moved through several states in quick succession. Recognition, confusion, something that might have been the first arrival of a feeling he hadn't expected to feel. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, the way you hold a door open just long enough for someone to understand you know they're there, and then she looked away. She was talking to a federal circuit court judge when Adrian arrived beside her, and the room did the thing rooms do when something significant happens in them. A slight, almost imperceptible reorientation of attention, the way iron filings move near a field. Adrian was not a man who entered a space without the space registering it. The judge noticed. The people nearest them noticed. And then Adrian, in full view of the assembled partners of Delworth and Cross, the board members of the Whitmore Foundation, Harlan Beaumont and Ethan Mercer, turned to Clara and inclined his head in a gesture that was not quite a bow, but was something older and more serious than a nod, and said, in a voice pitched for the immediate vicinity but carrying in the room's particular acoustics, "The Rotterdam matter is resolved. I wanted you to know before the evening went further, Ms. Ashford." The judge looked at Clara. "Do you two know each other?" he said, in the tone of a man who was already revising the category he'd put her in. "Adrian is my chief strategist," Clara said, with the same ease she'd have used to say he's my colleague. "He tends to find me when things need resolving." She didn't look at Ethan. She didn't need to. The room had heard it, and rooms like this ran on information, and the information that had just been transmitted was simple. The woman Ethan Mercer had walked away from in a hotel lobby 3 days ago was not who he'd thought she was, and he had just figured that out in front of everyone he was trying to impress. By 10 o'clock, 3 different people had asked Clara for her contact information. One of them, a senior partner at a firm that Delworth and Cross would have given significant things to have access to. Harlan Beaumont had looked at her twice from across the room with an expression that wasn't recognition exactly. He didn't know who she was yet, not precisely, but was the specific attention of a man who has noticed something that doesn't fit his model of the room and is running calculations. Ethan found her near the exit at 10:30, which she'd expected. She'd been waiting for it with the patient inevitability of someone watching a tide. "Clara." He said it the same way he'd said it in the hotel lobby, her name like a label. Then he seemed to hear it too because something crossed his face. "You look—" "Ethan," she said. He stopped. "Don't do this," she said. Not unkindly, more like someone who has already finished a calculation and is offering the other person the courtesy of the result before they waste energy on the process. "Whatever you were going to say, don't." He looked at Adrian, who had materialized at Clara's left without appearing to have moved there. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who is this?" he said. "Someone who works for me," Claire said. "Works for you." He said it with the particular inflection of a man who has spent 5 years subtly communicating to a woman that her professional life was smaller and less serious than his, and who has just had that framework removed from under him without warning. "Clara, what's going on? What is all this?" "All what?" she said. He gestured, a small lost gesture that took in the room, Adrian, the dress, all of it. "3 days ago you were standing in the rain," she said. "Yes, I was." She looked at him with the same steady, unhurried attention she'd used at the trust table that morning. 3 days is a long time, Ethan." His mouth worked for a moment. "I need to talk to you, not here. You should go back to Celeste," Clara said. "Harlan Beaumont is watching this conversation." She let that land. Watched his expression change. "You have more to lose from that than I do." She paused. "Though probably less than you think, given what I know about Novian partners and your sealed documentation problem." The color left his face in a way that she would not have believed could happen that visibly in a lit ballroom if she hadn't watched it. He stared at her, and for the first time in 5 years she saw something on Ethan Mercer's face that she had never put there and had never expected to, genuine, uncontrolled fear. "Have a good evening," she said, and walked away from him, and did not look back. In the car afterward, the city moving past the windows in its usual indifferent way, she sat with the feeling that the evening had left. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was cleaner than triumph. It was the particular sensation of having moved a very heavy object and discovered that it moved. Adrian sat across from her. He said nothing for a while, which she appreciated. "The Beaumont family," she said eventually. "How much do they know about who I am?" "As of tonight, they know you're someone with resources and a strategist who defers publicly to you," Adrian said. "They don't yet know the Ashmont name." "How long before they find out?" 48 hours, he said. Possibly less. Harlan Beaumont runs his own intelligence network. It's not as good as ours, but it's thorough. And when he finds out, he'll move, Adrian said simply. He's the type. The car turned north. Clara looked at the window, and the city looked back, and she was thinking about Ethan's face draining white in the ballroom, and she was thinking about the Rotterdam contract, and she was thinking about Petra Sandel's compromised line into the Cressida network, and about Lena Marsh in Queens with her burner phone and her careful positioning when her phone buzzed again. Not a text this time. A call. Unknown number, different from before. She answered. Ms. Ashford. Not Adrian's voice. Female. Controlled. Faintly accented. Eastern European, she thought. My name is not important yet. What is important is that Harlan Beaumont made 2 phone calls in the last hour from the Halloran's private lounge, and neither of them was to his daughter. A pause. One was to a man you have not heard of yet. The other was to a federal agent named Carver, who has been on the Beaumont payroll for 6 years. The line crackled slightly. They know your mother's name, Ms. Ashford, and they have decided that you are a problem that needs to be solved before you become a threat. Another pause, and in it Clara heard the quiet hiss of a city in the background, close to the caller, but different from New York. The pitch of it was wrong, the texture of the sound underneath. You have less time than you think. The call ended. Clara looked at Adrian. He had seen her expression change and was already alert, already leaning forward slightly, already in the mode she was starting to recognize as his operational mode. Stripped down, focused, every unnecessary thing cleared away. The Beaumont family knows who I am, she said, and they have a federal agent. He held her gaze, and this time the evenness in his expression was different. It wasn't composure over calculation. It was something harder, the face of a man who has spent 11 years preparing for the worst iteration of a bad situation and has just learned it's arrived. How long? He said. She said, less time than I think. Clara looked out the window. The city moved. The lights stacked. Adrian. She turned back to him. If they come for me, if Beaumont and whoever this federal agent is decide to move, what does that look like? He was quiet for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than he usually took. It looks like a very fast sequence of events, he said. Legal pressure, asset freeze attempts, possibly a manufactured criminal exposure. And behind all of it, the kind of enforcement that doesn't wear a badge. He held her gaze. It looks like what happened to organizations that didn't have their security protocols updated in time. Clara understood what he was saying. She had waited too long already, and she had not known she was waiting because she had not known there was a clock. Then we don't wait, she said. No, he said. We don't. She turned back to the window. They were on the West Side Highway now, the river running black alongside them, the lights of New Jersey flat and distant across the water. She was thinking about the woman on the phone, the voice, the accent, the fact that someone in the Cressida network had called her twice in 3 days to give her information that saved her each time, and that Cressida was supposed to be her enemy, and that nothing about this resolved cleanly into the shape she'd been given. Her phone buzzed. A text from the same unknown number as before. 4 words. Check the Rotterdam documents. She opened the digital file on her phone. She went to the Rotterdam contract. She went to the amendment framework she'd approved 2 days ago and sent to Dorian Voss for implementation. And she found it there, in the 3rd subclause of the financial terms, written in language that was almost exactly right, and just barely wasn't. A single provision that, executed, would transfer a controlling interest in the Rotterdam shipping concern not to the Ashmont Syndicate, but to a Luxembourg holding entity whose ultimate beneficial owner, Clara was now absolutely certain, was Harlan Beaumont. Dorian Voss had tried to sign away the Rotterdam operation under her name before she understood what she was signing. She looked up from the phone. She looked at Adrian. She said, with the perfect steadiness of a woman who has just understood that the betrayal was already inside the house, pull the car over. Marco pulled over on the West Side Highway at a point where the guardrail had a gap and the river was visible some. Black water, no movement, the kind of dark that doesn't reflect anything back. The car sat with its engine running and the heater pushing warm air that nobody in the vehicle was paying attention to. Clara handed Adrian the phone. She watched him read the provision. She watched his jaw set. "Voss," he said. "Voss," she said. He would have needed access to the amendment framework after you approved the base terms. Adrian was already thinking through it. She could see the sequence moving behind his eyes, which means he didn't write the provision himself. He had someone inserted after the fact, someone with document access. Who manages document access? Operationally, it routes through Cole. He looked up. Cole, the administrator with the two still eyes who'd been on Adrian's list of 4. Cole and Voss. Together or sequentially? "So we have 2 of them," Clara said. At minimum. At minimum." He handed the phone back. His voice was very even. "I should have caught this." "You had 48 hours and a warehouse fire and a federal agent to think about," she said. "You didn't catch it. Neither did I. It's done." She looked out at the river. "How do we move?" "Voss can't know we've seen the provision. The moment he thinks we know, he'll accelerate whatever the next step is." Adrian's hand was resting on his knee, and she could see the tension in it. Controlled, contained, but there. "We need to pull the amendment from the filing process without triggering a flag on his end. Can that be done tonight?" "I have someone in Rotterdam who can stall the processing. It'll look like a technical delay, nothing unusual." He was already reaching for his own phone. "But Clara." He stopped. Used her first name, which he hadn't done before, she noticed. If Beaumont made those calls from the gala tonight, and if Voss is moving on the Rotterdam operation simultaneously, this isn't coincidence. They're coordinated. This was planned before you walked into that meeting room. She sat with that. The heater hummed. The river didn't move. "They planned around me coming forward," she said. "They planned around the succession. Whoever takes Eleanor's seat, they were going to be walked into this. The gala, the amendment, the federal agent," he paused. "They've been planning it for 14 months. 14 months. Since her mother died." While Clara was in Washington Heights cataloging library acquisitions and making coffee and not knowing any of this existed, the people who wanted it were building a trap for whoever showed up to claim it. "Make the Rotterdam call," she said. "Then we go get Voss." He made the call in Dutch. Clipped, fast, 3 sentences. Then Marco was driving again, and Clara sat with her hands in her lap and her jaw tight, and her mind running the geometry of betrayal, figuring angles, and what she kept coming back to was the woman on the phone. The Eastern European accent. Cressida is supposed to be the enemy. But Cressida had warned her twice, and Cressida's money ran through Beaumont's network. "Adrian," she said, "is it possible that Cressida isn't working against us?" He turned his head slightly. "Define working against." "The warehouse in Red Hook, 5 probes in 8 months. What if those weren't attacks?" She looked at him. "What if someone inside Cressida was sending messages, trying to get our attention, trying to tell us something was wrong from the inside without being able to say it directly?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. "That would mean someone inside Cressida has a stake in the Ashmont Syndicate surviving," he said. "Or a stake in Harlan Beaumont not winning," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not surprise exactly, more like the specific quality of attention he gave things that had moved faster than he'd anticipated. "I need to make another call," he said. "Make it." Dorian Voss lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights that communicated money without effort, which was the most expensive kind of communication. It was 11:45 when Marco pulled up, and the building was dark except for a light on the second floor that suggested the man inside was awake and not expecting company. He opened the door in a silk robe with the particular confidence of a man who has never once opened his door to something he didn't control. That confidence lasted approximately 1.5 seconds. Clara walked in without being invited. Adrian came in behind her. Marco stayed at the door. Voss's living room was all dark wood and carefully chosen art. Clara sat in the chair nearest the door and crossed her legs and looked at him and said nothing. She let the silence work. She'd learned from a very young age, before she understood why she was learning it, that silence was a kind of pressure, and that the people who filled it fastest were the people with the most to manage. Voss lasted 7 seconds. Ms. Ashford, his voice was careful. It's very late. Rotterdam, she said. His face did something small and fast that she would have missed 3 days ago. The contract process is moving forward as discussed. Third subclause of the financial amendment, she said. The beneficial ownership provision. He stopped. Tell me who wrote it, she said. The calculation moved across his face with the visibility of a man who had been very confident about a situation and has just discovered the confidence was misplaced. She watched him assess his options, deny, deflect, negotiate, and watched him arrive at the conclusion that she already knew, which removed all three. It was a condition of the arrangement, he said finally. What arrangement? He tightened the robe's belt. The gesture was small and involuntary, and she understood it. He was pulling something around himself. Beaumont Capital approached me 8 months ago, he said. The proposal was straightforward. Facilitate the transfer of the Rotterdam asset during the transition period, when there was no principal authority to review the documentation closely. In exchange, financial security and a position in the restructured organization. Beaumont's organization. Yes. After he took ours. Voss looked at the floor. He wasn't certain the succession would produce a viable principal, he said. He thought the syndicate would fragment. He wanted assets positioned to absorb the pieces. He paused. I thought the same. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the trust meeting, his silver-haired composure, the way he'd brought up Rotterdam first. He'd been testing how much she knew. He'd been doing it from the moment she walked in. Does Beaumont know you've been compromised? She said. I'm not. He stopped himself, adjusted. He doesn't know about the tip line that came to you. He doesn't know about the woman who called you tonight. But you do, she said. He hesitated. Then, she contacted me 3 weeks ago, said she was running a parallel operation and needed the Ashmont succession to proceed cleanly. She didn't give me a name. What did she want from you? She wanted me to delay the Rotterdam transfer. She said Beaumont had a larger play and that the Rotterdam asset was a trigger for it, that if it transferred cleanly before you had time to consolidate, it would give him the legal leverage to tie up all Ashmont holdings in litigation while the federal angle moved. He looked up. I didn't delay it. I panicked. I pushed it forward. Clara sat with that. The woman, the voice on the phone, had been working this from multiple angles simultaneously, and Voss, given the option to be useful, had instead accelerated the problem. She looked at Adrian, who had not moved from near the door and whose face was doing that carved stone thing that meant he was managing something. Cole, she said to Voss, was he part of this? Cole provided the document access. He didn't know the full scope. He thought it was an internal administrative correction. Voss seemed to have settled into a kind of flat resignation, the affect of a man who has reached the far end of a mistake and found nothing on the other side. He's not a bad man. He was frightened. Most people who do bad things are frightened, Clara said. She stood. Dorian. She said his name and waited until he looked at her directly. You're going to send a corrected amendment to Rotterdam in the morning. The beneficial ownership provision disappears. You're going to tell Cole that the revision came from you, not from me, so that whoever Cole talks to, and I assume he talks to someone, doesn't receive that information prematurely. She looked at him steadily. And you're going to continue attending trust meetings and performing your function with complete normalcy until I tell you otherwise. He blinked. You're not removing you. She picked up her coat from the chair arm. Not tonight. You're more useful where you are. She moved toward the door. But Dorian, I want you to understand something. What you feel right now, the exposure, the certainty that things can collapse on you very fast. Hold on to that. Keep it close. It'll help you make better decisions. In the car heading back, Adrian said, You left him in place. He's a signal, she said. Beaumont will expect the Rotterdam transfer to proceed. If it doesn't, he moves faster. If it does, we control the timing. She looked at the passing streets. I need Beaumont to feel like he's winning until we're ready. And Cole. Cole is frightened. Frightened people make mistakes, and frightened people can be redirected. She paused. Who does Cole report to inside Beaumont's network? Can you find that? By morning, he said. She got 3 hours of sleep. It didn't feel like sleep. It felt like a brief interruption of thinking, during which the thinking continued in a less supervised way. She was at the desk in the Cobble Hill building by 6, working through the documents Adrian had staged for her, building the fuller picture of the Beaumont operation, its reach into the organization's trust structure, the federal agent named Carver and his 6-year payroll history, the Luxembourg Fund, and its Rotterdam tentacle. The woman from the phone was the gap that didn't close. She appeared in the data the way a ship appears in fog, suggested by displacement, by the shape of the space around her, but not directly visible. Someone with access to Beaumont's call schedule. Someone with a connection to the Cressida network. Someone who wanted the Ashmont succession to succeed and was willing to run a parallel intelligence operation to ensure it. Adrian came in at 7 with coffee and the Cole report. Cole reported to a man named Stefan Brandt, a Beaumont Capital Operations Director who had been traveling between New York and Riga for the last 18 months. Riga. The Cressida logistics connection ran through Riga. Stefan Brandt, Clara said. Is he Cressida? He has a history with Eastern European financial networks. His name appears in 2 documents adjacent to Cressida-connected entities. Adrian set the report down. But he's primarily Beaumont, has been for 7 years. So Brandt is the bridge, she said, between Beaumont and Cressida. He's the reason those organizations are connected at all. She looked at the map she'd been building on the desk surface. Not a physical map. She'd been using a legal pad, sketching connections with lines. Which means if someone inside Cressida wanted to work against Beaumont, they'd have to go around Brandt. They'd have to build a separate line. She looked up. They'd have to find someone inside our organization who wasn't compromised, and someone inside our organization they could reach without Brandt seeing it. Petra, Adrian said. Petra. Clara sat back. Petra's compromised line to Cressida. She thinks she's been managing a source. What if the source started as genuine, and then someone inside Cressida started using that line for something different, not to extract from us, to reach us? He was very still. The woman on the phone used Petra's line to find you. That's my read. Which means she's been inside Cressida this whole time, and she's been trying to get information to us through channels that Brandt can't see. He paused. Why? What does she want? I don't know yet, Claire said. But she's kept us alive twice, which means she needs us alive. She looked at him. Set up a meeting. I don't have a number for her. Petra does, Clara said. Petra just doesn't know it. The next 72 hours moved with the compressed inevitability of things that have been set in motion and cannot be stopped, only directed. Clara ran 4 trust meetings in 3 days, each one building on the last, each one watched by Dorian Voss with the careful stillness of a man performing normality while privately holding his own head underwater. She approved the Rotterdam Amendment as corrected, watched it move through the processing chain, and waited. Cole performed his function without deviation. Nobody moved. Then the Whitmore Museum Gala happened, and everything broke at once. The event was a private fundraiser, smaller than the Foundation Gala, more select, hosted in the museum's Antiquities wing with the collection's Roman sculptures standing in their alcoves like indifferent witnesses. Clara had been invited by one of the real estate contacts she'd made at the Whitmore Foundation event, a woman named Diane Holt, who had called her twice since and who seemed, in Clara's assessment, to be genuinely interested in the Ashmont organization's real estate portfolio without knowing exactly what the Ashmont organization was. It was a legitimate invitation and a legitimate room, and Clara had almost declined it, but Adrian had said, Harlan Beaumont's wife sits on the museum board. He'll be there. And Harlan Beaumont, 3 days after his phone calls from the Halloran's private lounge, needed to see what Clara was doing. He needed to see her operating normally, confidently, without any indication that she'd found the Rotterdam provision or identified Voss. So she went. Dark green this time, structured differently from the gala dress, her mother's choice. She'd found a photograph of Eleanor at 33 in a green dress and hadn't been able to say whether the resemblance was physical or something else, something carried. Adrian at her left, 2 steps behind. Marco outside. She was standing near the Greek vase collection, listening to Diane Holt describe a zoning dispute in the Flatiron District that had relevance to a property Clara's organization held a minority interest in, when she saw the man she didn't recognize. He was standing near the East Corridor entrance, 40 feet away, and he had the particular quality of someone who is not interested in the art and is not particularly trying to appear as if he is. 50. Heavy-shouldered, with a government employee's way of wearing civilian clothes that made the clothes look slightly wrong. He was looking at Clara with the directional attention of someone who had come here to look at her specifically. She kept her eyes on Diane and kept listening and said nothing, but she moved 3 degrees in her position so that Adrian, when she glanced at him 30 seconds later, was already looking at the man. Adrian's eyes came back to her. Infinitesimal headshake. Not one of ours. She finished the conversation with Diane, excused herself, and moved toward the Roman alcoves where the crowd thinned. Adrian fell in beside her. 3rd alcove, he said quietly. 30 seconds. They stood in front of a marble athlete missing both forearms, and Adrian said, "His name is Carver. The federal agent, 6 years on Beaumont's payroll. Here tonight, looking at Clara." "He came to see me," she said. "He came to assess you," Adrian said. "Beaumont wants to know if you know." "Then I should let him see that I don't," she said. "I should." The sound was wrong before she identified it. Not loud, the opposite, a pressure drop, the specific silence that happens a half-second before something very fast occurs. Adrian moved before she processed it, his body turning and his arm coming across her shoulders with a force that wasn't gentle but was controlled, pushing her into the alcove and into the marble athlete's base, while his other hand went inside his jacket and the marble behind them cracked. A single clean crack, and then the thin white line where a silent shot had taken a piece of the wall. The room took 3 seconds to understand what had happened. 3 seconds of someone saying, "What was that?" and someone else saying, "Don't," and then the controlled collapse into panic that large rooms full of people achieve when a threat announces itself. The screaming and the movement toward exits. Clara was on the floor with her back against the marble base, and Adrian was in front of her, down on one knee, and he was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow where a fragment had caught him, and his face was completely without expression, the way a face goes when training takes over from personality. He had his weapon in his right hand and his left hand on her arm, and he said, "Can you move?" "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "East corridor, side exit. Don't stand fully until we're past the alcove line." He looked at her with those flat, focused eyes. "With me." They moved. The room was controlled chaos around them. People going for exits, security trying to push back against the crowd flow, phones out, voices overlapping. Clara moved in the space Adrian made, staying low, staying close, using the crowd's panic as cover the way he'd clearly done before, in situations she didn't want to catalog right now. The east corridor was clearing fast, the side exit ahead, and she could see Marco's face through the door's narrow window before they reached it. He was already there. He'd heard something or been signaled, his expression carrying the compressed focus of a man moving toward a problem he knew. They got through. The night air hit. Marco was moving them toward the car before the door finished closing behind them, and the sound of the museum's alarm beginning to rise was already a block behind. In the car, Adrian pressed the back of his hand to the cut above his eyebrow and looked at the blood on his knuckles with the disinterested attention of a man checking a tire. "It was a clean shot," he said. "Professional distance, suppressed. 1 round." "1 round is enough," Clara said. Her hands were in her lap. She looked at them. They were steady, which she noted with the same disinterested attention Adrian had given his cut. 1 round from that angle, at that range, in a crowded room. "A professional doesn't miss," he said, "which means it wasn't meant to connect." She looked at him. "It was a message." "It was a message," he said. "Beaumont wanted you to know he has reach. He wanted you scared. He wanted you to understand that last night at the gala was a mistake, and that the mistake has consequences." "Or Carver wanted us to know," she said. He was in the room. He was watching when it happened. She paused. Where was he when the shot came? Adrian thought for 2 seconds. The east corridor entrance, he said. He could see the alcove. He watched it happen, she said. He stood there and watched it happen. She felt something change in her chest. Not fear. It had already moved past fear into something colder and more precise. He's not just on Beaumont's payroll. He's operational. That changes our legal exposure significantly, Adrian said. Yes, she said. It does. The Cobble Hill building at midnight had a different quality from the same building at 2 in the morning. The former was operational, people moving, work being done, the barely contained energy of an organization that had been running without a head for 14 months and was recalibrating to having one. Clara stood at the center table with the cut on Adrian's face cleaned and closed with a single butterfly strip and the room arranged around her. 3 operational leads, Adrian and Petra Sandell, who had been called in without explanation and who was sitting with her spine very straight and her hands flat on the table with the careful composure of someone who doesn't know what she's been called in for but has decided not to show that she doesn't know. Clara looked at Petra. Tell me about your source inside Cressida, she said. Petra's composure held. I've been running an informational exchange with a Cressida-adjacent contact for approximately 7 months, she said. I disclosed this to the trust at the 6-month mark. It was classified as an operational intelligence asset. Did you disclose everything you exchanged? A pause. Small, but there. I disclosed the substantive content, yes. The contact initiated the exchange, Clara said. Not you. Correct. And in the last 3 weeks, have you received anything from this contact that you haven't yet filed in the Trust's intelligence record? Petra looked at the table, looked back up. A request, she said. I received a request. The contact asked me to facilitate a communication to the incoming principal authority. The request came with a contact number. She reached into the pocket of her jacket. She'd been wearing it when called in, hadn't had time to change, and put a folded paper on the table. I didn't act on it because I didn't know who the incoming authority was going to be, or whether the succession was going to produce someone I could trust with an unvetted contact inside a rival network. Clara picked up the paper, opened it. A phone number with a country code she didn't immediately recognize. Below it, in precise small handwriting, tell her I knew Eleanor. The room went very quiet. Clara looked at the paper for a long time. She was aware of Adrian beside her, perfectly still, and of the operational leads at the edges of the room, and of Petra across the table watching her with the first fully unguarded expression she'd shown in 3 days of meetings. She knew my mother, Clara said. Not a question. That's what the note says, Petra said. Clara set the paper down on the table. She looked at Adrian. His face was doing the carved stone thing again, but different from before. Something had shifted behind it. Something she might have called unsettlement on a man who unsettled more easily. Do you know who this is? She said. He was quiet for 1 second. I have a suspicion, he said. I'd rather confirm it before I say it out loud. Say it anyway. He looked at the paper, looked at her. Eleanor had a partner before your father, he said. A woman she'd worked with from the beginning. They built the syndicate's intelligence operation together in the 70s and early 80s. When Eleanor left for the States, this woman stayed in Europe. He paused. She went by a different name at that point, but the last reliable intelligence I had on her placed her in Riga, running an independent operation connected to Cressida, Clara said. Adjacent to Cressida, yes, he said. She's not Cressida. She's older than Cressida. She was there before it and she's outlasted several versions of it. He met Clara's eyes. If she's been inside the Cressida network running a parallel operation, and if Stefan Brandt is Beaumont's bridge into that network, then she's been working against Brandt from the inside for as long as Beaumont has been building toward this, Clara said. He nodded. She was protecting the succession, Clara said. She's been protecting it since my mother died. Maybe longer. She picked up the paper again. She knew Carver was going to be at the museum tonight. Almost certainly. The shot was hers, Clara said. It came out flat and certain, the way things come out when you've been carrying a question and the answer arrives all at once. She was the one who fired in the museum. She wasn't trying to hit me. She was warning Carver. She was warning Beaumont. She was showing them that she has reach inside their operation. She looked at the number, and she wants me to call her. Adrian said nothing for a moment. Then, she also knows things about Eleanor that I don't, he said. Things that could affect how you understand the succession, how you understand your position here. He paused, and the pause had a specific weight. I need to tell you something I should have told you the first night. Clara looked at him. Your mother's arrangement with the trust had a condition, he said. The succession was not unconditional. Eleanor stipulated that the heir, in order to assume full controlling authority, had to be confirmed by a second party, someone outside the organization who had co-held authority with Eleanor during the original operating period. He was watching her with great care. I didn't tell you because I didn't know if that second party was still alive or reachable or willing. He looked at the paper on the table. Now I think she's been trying to reach you since the night you made the first phone call. Clara stared at him. The succession isn't complete, she said. Everything I've done in the last 5 days, the trust meetings, the Rotterdam contract, the authorization I gave you, is real and binding within the organization's internal structure, he said. But it's not complete under Eleanor's terms. He kept his voice even. Without the second confirmation, a challenge to your authority, a legal challenge, a formal challenge from inside the trust, could succeed. And Beaumont knows this, she said. The silence was its own answer. She sat with it. She sat with the whole architecture of it, the trap that had been built not just around the succession, but inside it, in the terms her mother had set. The terms that were supposed to protect the transition and had instead created a gap that a man with a federal agent and a Rotterdam provision and 14 months of preparation had been aiming at from the beginning. She sat with the fact that Adrian had known about the condition and had not told her, and she sat with the fact that the woman who could complete the succession had been firing warning shots in museum wings and sending text messages at midnight and writing notes in small handwriting that said, "Tell her I knew Eleanor." She stood up. She looked at Petra. "Leave," she said, not unkindly. "Go home. Don't contact your source tonight. I'll find you in the morning." Petra left. The operational leads left. The room reduced to Clara and Adrian in the late-night quiet of the building. She didn't look at him for a moment. She looked at the table, at the paper with the number, at the map she'd been building in her head since the first phone call in the rain, which had just been redrawn from the foundation up. Then she looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. He met her eyes. "Because you were already carrying a significant amount," he said, "and because I needed to know you were going to stay before I gave you a reason that might make you leave." A pause. "That was a miscalculation. I should have trusted you with it." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She picked up the paper. "I'm calling her tonight." "It's 3 a.m. She fired a gun in a museum," Clara said. "She's awake." She dialed. It rang once. "I wondered when you'd call," the woman said. Her voice was older than it had sounded on the phone in the car. The control was the same, but beneath it was the particular texture of someone who had lived in dangerous places for a very long time and had developed a specific relationship with patients. "You're angrier than Eleanor was at your age." "I don't know anything about you," Clara said. "No," the woman said. "You don't. That's the first thing we need to fix." A sound in the background that might have been wind. "And the second thing we need to fix is Harlan Beaumont, who has been on the phone with Agent Carver in the last 40 minutes discussing an emergency asset freeze to be filed with a federal court in the morning. If that filing goes through before your succession is confirmed, Ms. Ashford, every holding this organization has, legitimate and otherwise, goes into legal suspension until the question of authority is resolved." She paused. "Which without my confirmation, it cannot be." Clara felt the cold move through her. Not the hollow cold of the hotel lobby. Something different. The cold of understanding a situation's full geometry for the first time. "How long do we have?" she said. "The filing can be submitted at 9 a.m. when the federal court opens," the woman said. "It's now 3:14 in the morning." She paused. "That's 5 hours and 46 minutes to either stop the filing or complete the succession, and you cannot do both from New York." "Where are you?" Clara said. The woman told her. Clara looked at Adrian. He had heard it. The building's acoustics, her phone's volume, his proximity. His expression said he'd registered the location and the timeline, and the implication of both, and that he was already calculating whether it was possible and at what cost. "If I leave New York tonight," Clara said into the phone, "Beaumont will know." "Yes," the woman said, "and if he knows I've left, he accelerates." "Yes," the woman said again, "which is why you're not leaving alone, and why you're not leaving quietly, and why the woman you leave behind you is going to have to be convincing enough that Beaumont doesn't look in the direction you're actually going until it's too late." Clara looked at the table, at the paper, at Adrian. She thought about the woman on the phone, her mother's partner, her mother's equal, someone who had spent 40 years waiting for a version of this night and had spent the last 14 months positioning herself to make it survivable. She thought about Ethan Mercer's face going white in the Grand Halloran Ballroom, and about the Rotterdam Provision, and about the shot that cracked the marble in the museum alcove, fired not to kill but to signal, a message written in a language she was only now beginning to read fluently enough to understand. She thought about who she'd been 6 days ago, standing in the rain on West 54th Street with her legs not working right. She was not that woman anymore, and she could not go back to being her, and she had stopped wanting to at some point in the last 5 days that she hadn't marked but could now locate, looking backward, with the precision of someone who understands exactly where a road changed direction. "Tell me what I need to do," she said into the phone, and the woman began to speak, and Clara listened with everything she had, because there was no room left in the next 6 hours for anything she was only half paying attention to. The woman's name was Mara Voss. Not Dorian Voss's relative. Clara confirmed that in the first 30 seconds of the call's second phase, when Mara anticipated the question before Clara asked it and said flatly that the name was coincidental and that she'd been using it for 11 years and had no intention of changing it because a man who happened to share it had turned out to be a coward. The directness of it, the slight contempt in how she said coward, precise as a blade tap, told Clara more about Mara in 6 words than the previous 3 minutes of tactical information had. "Where exactly?" Clara said. "Newark Liberty. There's a charter service on the South Terminal's private side. The flight is already filed. It leaves at 4:55. A pause. "Bring Viscari. Leave Marco. I need someone in New York who Beaumont's people recognize." Clara looked at Adrian. He was already moving, not toward the door, toward the equipment cabinet at the room's far wall, the one she'd noted on the first night and hadn't asked about because there were only so many things she could absorb at once. He opened it. Inside was the kind of contents she'd half expected and still wasn't fully prepared to see arranged so practically. Communications equipment, documents in several different formats, 2 handguns in foam-lined cases, medical supplies, cash in banded stacks. "How long is the flight?" Claire said into the phone. 7 hours? You land at 10 local, which is 4 a.m. New York time. The filing window opens at 9 a.m. New York time. Mara's voice was completely without urgency, which was more alarming than urgency would have been. "That gives us 5 hours after landing to complete the confirmation and transmit it to the organization's legal structure before Carver's filing reaches a judge. And if we're late? Then the filing succeeds, the assets freeze, and Harlan Beaumont spends the next 18 months in federal court arguing that the Ashmont Syndicate's succession produced no legitimate authority while his attorneys quietly acquire the pieces." A pause that had texture to it. "I've watched him do it to 2 other organizations. He's patient, and he's thorough, and he does not make mistakes he hasn't planned for." Another pause. "Except one." "What one?" "He didn't plan for you," Mara said. "He planned for an heir who didn't know what they were walking into. He got something different." She paused. "Eleanor would be difficult right now." Clara didn't respond to that. She wasn't ready to receive things about her mother from a stranger at 3 in the morning, regardless of how much the stranger knew. "What do I tell Marco to do?" she said. Mara told her. Marco, when Clara came down and explained it, looked at her with the measured expression of a man who has received difficult instructions before and evaluates them not by difficulty, but by source. He looked at the instructions. He looked at Clara. He nodded once, which was all the agreement she needed from him. She changed in 4 minutes. Dark clothes, flat shoes, nothing that announced itself. She took the cash Adrian handed her and the document wallet he'd prepared. She didn't ask when he'd prepared it. She suspected the answer was sometime in the last 48 hours, which told her something about how he'd been thinking. And she stood in the Cobble Hill building's doorway at 3:41 in the morning and looked back at the room where the last 6 days had happened. "We're not coming back to this," she said. "Not about the building. About the version of the situation they were leaving." "No," Adrian said. "We're not." They took a car she didn't recognize, driven by a man she'd never seen, which Adrian had sourced with 2 phone calls while she was changing. The BQE at 3:45 in the morning was nearly empty, the city's skeletal nighttime self, and she sat in the back with the document wallet in her lap and her mind running through the architecture of what had to happen in the next. She checked her phone. 5 hours and 12 minutes. Adrian sat beside her and said nothing for the first 10 minutes, and she was grateful for it. When he spoke, it was the confirmation process. "How much do you know about what it involves?" "Nothing," she said. "You tell me." "Eleanor designed it herself in the mid-90s after your father died and she was thinking about succession for the first time," he said. "It requires 2 things. The first is a direct face-to-face meeting between the heir and the confirming party. It can't be done remotely. It can't be done by proxy. The second is a formal declaration transmitted through the organization's legal structure, time-stamped and witnessed by a third party acceptable to both sides." He paused. "The legal structure requires that the declaration reach the organization's primary attorney of record no later than, in your case, if Beaumont files at 9/8/59. Who is the attorney of record? "A firm in Amsterdam. Hendricks and Brawl. They've held the Ashmont legal structure since 1983. He paused. "They're expecting the call. They've been expecting it since Eleanor died. They just didn't know when." "And the third-party witness?" "Mara has someone," he said. "I don't know who. She said she'd have them present when we land." Clara looked at the tunnel ahead of them, the light changing as they entered it, the particular compressed quality of the air inside. She thought about Dorian Voss in his brownstone and what he was doing right now. Sleeping, probably, in the robe, in the cultivated comfort of a man who had made a bad bet and been given an unexpected extension. She thought about Carver, federal agent, 6 years on Beaumont's payroll, who had stood in the museum wing and watched a shot crack the marble 2 feet from her head. "The shot in the museum," she said. "Mara fired it." "Almost certainly, yes," Adrian said. "She was in New York tonight, and she didn't make contact directly. She couldn't risk being seen with you before the confirmation is complete," he said. "If Beaumont's people connected her to you, they'd know what she was. They'd know the succession was being completed, and they'd accelerate everything. So she's been in New York, running interference, staying invisible, and sending me text messages at midnight," Claire said. "Yes. She's been doing this since my mother died." "Possibly longer," he said. "Mara was Eleanor's closest operational partner for 15 years. When Eleanor left for the States, Mara stayed in Europe and built something parallel, something that could watch the syndicates back from the outside while Eleanor ran it from the inside. They maintained contact, infrequently, securely. Eleanor told me about her once. She said Mara was the only person she'd ever trusted completely, and that she'd spent 30 years being grateful she had, and afraid of what it meant." Clara sat with that. What did she mean? Afraid of what it meant. Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I think she meant that trusting someone completely is a kind of vulnerability that doesn't resolve," he said. "That you carry it." The charter terminal at Newark was the size of a waiting room and had 3 people in it at 4 in the morning, none of whom looked at Clara and Adrian when they came through the door. The man at the desk had their documents before they reached him, processed them in 90 seconds, and directed them to the tarmac with the brisk efficiency of someone who handled unusual departures at unusual hours and had long since stopped forming opinions about them. The plane was small, 8 seats, 2 crew, already running. They were in the air by 4:58, 3 minutes behind schedule, and Clara sat in the forward-facing seat and watched Newark disappear below and behind, and felt the thing that happened when you leave a place in circumstances that prevent you from knowing when you'll return. A specific suspension, neither grief nor relief, just the awareness of a door having closed. She slept for 2 hours. Not planned. She'd had no intention of sleeping. There was too much to hold. But the body does what it needs to do when it's been running for 6 days on 3 hours here and 4 hours there. And when she woke up, the light outside the window had changed, and Adrian was awake across the aisle, watching her with the careful expression of someone who has been watching for a while and has decided not to pretend he wasn't. "How long?" she said. "4 hours out," he said. "You needed it." She straightened, took the bottle of water from the seat pocket, drank half of it without stopping. "Tell me about Beaumont," she said. "Not the organization. Him. What kind of man is he?" Adrian considered it. "The kind who is never in the room when the worst thing happens," he said. "He structures everything with distance. Brandt is his hands, Carver is his shield, Voss was his inside access. Beaumont himself sits back and watches and adjusts." He paused. "He is genuinely intelligent, and he is genuinely patient, and he has no particular emotional investment in outcomes other than winning. People who can afford not to have feelings about what they do are difficult to outmaneuver because they don't make emotional mistakes." "But he made one," Clara said. "Mara said so." "He underestimated the succession," Adrian said. "He planned for weakness at the transition point, and he was right that there would be weakness. 14 months without a principal, security protocols degraded, the trust divided. He was right about all of it." He met her eyes. "He just didn't plan for the person who showed up." Clara looked out the window at the sky, which was fully light now, the particular clear, pale light of morning at altitude, and she felt something in her chest that she'd been feeling in fragments for 6 days finally assemble itself into something nameable. Not confidence. Confidence was too simple. Something more like the feeling of a thing fitting. The right key in the right lock. The sensation of a shape that had been present all along becoming suddenly legible. She thought about her mother making soup on Sundays. She thought about the cardigans, the careful cursive, the library books stacked on the kitchen table on Saturday mornings. She thought about Eleanor Ashford, born Eleanor Montclair in Lyon in 1961, who had built an intelligence operation and run it for 15 years and then walked away to make a different life, and who had put a phone number in her daughter's phone for the night everything fell apart, and who had known, apparently, that the night would come and had prepared for it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything she did. She hadn't been hiding who she was. She'd been keeping it somewhere safe until it was needed. They landed at 11:14 local time, 7 minutes behind the filed schedule, which put them at 4 hours and 45 minutes before the New York Federal Court opened. The airport was small, a regional facility with the particular quiet of places that don't process a lot of traffic, and a car was waiting on the tarmac before the plane's door opened, which told Clara that Mara's operational reach extended to ground logistics here as fluently as it did to text messages sent from burner phones in Queens. The driver was a woman, which Clara noted. Late 40s, compact, with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to operating in environments where efficiency was not optional. She did not introduce herself. She drove. The building they arrived at was a working structure, not a converted space like the Cobble Hill warehouse, but a place that was what it appeared to be, a small commercial building housing what looked from the outside like a consulting firm with frosted windows and a discreet placard. Inside, the ground floor was a workspace in active use. 3 people at stations, screens running data Clara could see were financial feeds and communication intercepts. The whole setup with the quiet hum of something that had been running steadily for a long time. Mara was in the room at the back. She was 61, Clara knew from what Adrian had told her on the plane, and she looked like a woman who had spent 61 years at close quarters with difficult reality and had arrived at a specific accommodation with it. Not hardness exactly, not the brittleness that comes from fighting everything, but a quality of settledness in the body, a weight to the way she occupied space. Silver-haired, not tall, with eyes that were the particular dark brown that photographs usually wrong, because they carry too much information for a single tone. She was wearing what appeared to be a work jacket over a dark shirt, no jewelry, flat shoes, and she was looking at Clara the way Clara had looked at the Rotterdam documents, building a picture, checking it against something internal, adjusting. "You look like her," Mara said, more than the photograph suggested. You've seen photographs of me, Claire said. Eleanor sent them, every few years for the last 15. She said it without sentimentality. She wanted me to know you in case this day came, and she couldn't introduce you herself. She paused. I'm sorry she's gone. She was the best person I knew in any capacity. Clara held the gaze. She didn't respond to that yet. There was too much in it and not enough time for what it deserved. Tell me about the filing, she said. Mara moved to the table. On it was a map of Lower Manhattan and several printed documents Clara recognized as federal court procedural forms. Carver filed for an emergency temporary restraining order at 8:47 New York time, she said, 47 minutes ago. It went to a duty judge named Reinhardt, who is reliable in the sense that he processes emergency filings on their apparent merits rather than on the basis of who files them. She looked up. The filing cites ambiguous succession authority in the Ashmont organization and argues that asset freeze is necessary to prevent dissipation pending resolution. It references the Rotterdam Contract Amendment, the original version, with Beaumont's provision included, as evidence of irregular internal transactions. Voss? Clara said. Voss provided them a copy of the original amendment before you corrected it, Mara said. He gave it to Brandt 2 nights ago, after your visit, apparently. She said it without expression. He's frightened and he's covering positions. He gave Beaumont something to use without knowing you'd already neutralized it. Can Reinhardt be reached? No, Mara said. And we don't want him reached. We want the confirmation filed before he rules. She looked at the documents. If the confirmation reaches Hendricks and Braille with a timestamp before Reinhardt's order, the organization has legitimate authority on record and the TRO has no standing. It doesn't stop everything. Beaumont can litigate further. But it changes the terrain fundamentally. He loses the first move. She paused. The confirmation needs to be witnessed, signed, transmitted, and received before 8:59 New York time. Clara checked her phone. 3 hours and 51 minutes. Where's the witness? She said. On his way, Mara said. He'll be here in 40 minutes. Adrian said, Who is he? Mara looked at him. There was a quality to how she looked at Adrian. Something that wasn't distrust exactly, but was a careful calibration, like someone checking the tension on a wire. His name is Henk Brawl, she said. The second partner at Hendricks and Brawl. He'll witness here, transmit directly, and have confirmation of receipt before he leaves the building. She paused. He's 70 years old, and he has been waiting to do this specific thing since Eleanor set the succession terms in 1997. He will not be late. Clara looked at Mara for a moment. You've been running this, she said, since my mother died. You've been running a parallel operation to protect the succession, watching the Beaumont threat build, working against Brandt from inside the Cressida network, trying to get information to us, to me, through whatever channels you could find without exposing yourself. She paused. The warehouse probes, the text messages, the shot in the museum. Yes, Mara said. Why didn't you just contact Adrian directly? Because I didn't know if Adrian was clean, Mara said simply. I knew Eleanor trusted him, but Eleanor had been dead for 14 months, and a great deal can change in 14 months, and I had no way to verify his position from outside without revealing mine. She held Clara's gaze. I needed to reach you, the heir, someone who hadn't had time yet to be compromised. A pause. The phone number in your phone. Eleanor put it there. I gave her the number 5 years before she died. She made me promise to keep it active. Clara thought about her phone in the rain, the contact that hadn't been there. Call this number when you have nothing left. The way the world had turned over in the 6 days since, the way the map had been redrawn and redrawn and redrawn until she barely recognized the first version of it. My mother trusted you completely, Clara said. Yes, Mara said, and I her. Then I'll extend you provisional trust on that basis, Clara said, and build my own as we go. She looked at the table. Tell me everything about Carver. Mara told her. Carver's name was Richard Carver, 17 years with the Federal Financial Crimes Division, decorated twice, which made the 6 years on Beaumont's payroll a more sophisticated corruption than the simple kind. He had been genuinely effective at his job for the first 11 years, had built real credibility, and had then leveraged it with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that useful corruption requires a foundation of legitimacy. He had 3 cases currently active through which he could, with the right documentation, apply pressure on organizations with unclear legal standing. The TRO was his instrument. He'd used similar tools twice before for Beaumont, both times against organizations that had not had anyone positioned to respond in time. When the confirmation goes through, Clara said, what does that do to Carver's filing? Legally, it removes his premise, Mara said. Operationally, it makes him a liability for Beaumont. A federal agent who filed an emergency TRO on fraudulent premises at the direction of a private financial actor is a federal agent facing a very different kind of scrutiny. She paused. He'll know that the moment the confirmation is transmitted. And Beaumont. Beaumont will move, Mara said. He's not the kind of man who accepts a lost position quietly. When the TRO fails, he'll escalate. She met Clara's eyes. That's the part that doesn't resolve in an Amsterdam courtroom. Clara understood what she was saying. He'll come directly. He has other instruments beyond Carver, Mara said. He has the people who handled the museum. He has Brandt and whatever Brandt controls. She set her hands flat on the table. I've been preparing for that move for 8 months. I have 3 people inside Beaumont's operational network who are not loyal to him. When he gives the order, I'll know it before his people receive it. A pause. But knowing it isn't the same as stopping it. The 40 minutes until Henk Braal arrived were the longest of the 6 days. Clara used them. She went through every document Mara had staged on the table. The confirmation protocol, the legal structure, the succession terms her mother had written in 1997, 2 years after Thomas Ashford had died, and 3 years after she'd watched Eleanor fold herself into the quieter life, the cardigans and the soup, the school pickups, the careful ordinary love that had been real while also being a kind of cover for everything underneath. She read her mother's handwriting on the original succession document, not a photocopy, the actual document, on paper that had aged in that particular way that paper ages when it's been stored well and opened rarely, and felt something shift in her chest that was not grief but adjacent to it, the feeling of a door she'd thought was closed, turning out to have been open all along. The 3rd paragraph of the succession terms said, the heir of record, upon confirmation, assumes not merely the operational authority of the organization, but its obligations, to the people who serve it, to the communities it operates within, and to the principle that power held without accountability is power borrowed against a debt that always comes due. Clara read it twice. She thought about what kind of woman writes that, in 1997, about a criminal empire. She thought about what kind of woman believes it and still builds the empire and still runs it for 15 years and then steps away to make soup on Sundays. And she thought that the answer to that question was probably the most complete explanation of her mother she would ever have access to. Henk Braal arrived at 12:50 local time, which was 6:50 New York time, which gave them 2 hours and 9 minutes. He was exactly 70, and he moved like it, carefully, with the deliberate attention to his own body of someone who has been told to slow down by doctors and has made peace with slowing down without having made peace with it entirely. He had the papers in a leather case, and he set them on the table and looked at Clara with eyes that had the specific quality of someone who has been holding something in trust for a very long time and is finally delivering it. Your mother was a remarkable woman, he said. I know, Clara said. Let's begin. The confirmation process took 47 minutes. It was formal in the way that things are formal when they've been designed to last. Not ceremony for ceremony's sake, but precision, the kind of structure that closes loopholes because it was designed by someone who understood what loopholes cost. Mara confirmed her identity and her co-authority status under the original syndicate charter. Braal witnessed. Clara signed in 6 places, each signature watched, each page dated and initialed. Mara countersigned. Braal's assistant, a young woman who had been sitting quietly at the room's edge for the entire time, and who turned out to be a licensed notary in 3 jurisdictions, applied the necessary stamps with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been briefed and prepared. At 13:41 local time, 7:41 New York time, Henk Braal transmitted the completed confirmation package to Hendricks and Braal's primary server in Amsterdam, and copied the organization's full legal record directly to the federal court's electronic filing system with a cover document that Clara had helped Mara draft in the previous 40 minutes. A formal notice of legitimate succession authority, time-stamped and witnessed, citing the Ashmont organization's founding legal structure and directly responding to Carver's TRO filing. The receipt confirmation came back from Amsterdam in 4 minutes. Clara looked at the timestamp on her phone. 7:45 New York time, 1 hour and 14 minutes before the filing window. She looked at Mara. Mara looked at her with the expression of someone who has been running toward a specific point for 8 months and has arrived and is now recalibrating for whatever comes next. "It's done," Mara said. "The legal piece is done." "But Beaumont moves now," Clara said. "Yes," Mara said. "He moves now." Her phone rang. Adrian, who had been in the adjacent room for the last 2 hours managing communications with the New York operation, appeared in the doorway at the same moment. His face said the call was already on his end too. She answered. Marco's voice compressed and fast. "Beaumont's people picked up Voss 40 minutes ago, and they have coal." A pause. "And there's something else. They went to Petra Sandel's apartment this morning. She's not there. Her contact, the Cressida line, went dead an hour ago." Clara looked at Adrian. He was already reading the same implication. Petra's Cressida contact going dark at the same moment Beaumont moved on Voss and Cole was not coincidence. "They burned the line," she said. "Brandt burned it. He knows we used it." "Or Petra burned it herself," Adrian said quietly, "to protect whoever was on the other end." Clara looked at Mara. Mara's expression had changed, something small but definite, a shift in the set of her jaw. "Petra contacted someone inside my network 8 days ago," Mara said, "without my direction. She made a lateral move. She reached someone who she thought was just a Cressida source and who is actually one of mine." She paused. "If Brandt burned the line from his end, that person is exposed." "How exposed?" Clara said. Mara looked at her with eyes that had gone very flat and very steady. "Critically," she said. The room held that for 2 seconds. Clara's phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number, so a new one, not the previous burner. 3 words. Brooklyn Warehouse. Tonight. She showed it to Adrian. He looked at it and then at her, and his jaw was set in the way it had been set the night of the museum. The particular tension of a man who has assessed a situation and found it worse than he'd prefer and is adjusting without flinching. "Beaumont is setting the location," she said. "He wants control of the terrain," Adrian said. "He has Voss and Cole," she said. "He thinks that gives him leverage over the organization. He doesn't know the confirmation went through." She looked at the text. "He's inviting me to a meeting he thinks he controls, where he has my people, where he has whatever Brandt brings, and where Carver probably has a reason to be in the area. If you don't go, he uses Voss and Cole against the organization," Mara said, "and he tries the legal route again with a different instrument." "If I go, I walk into a room he's arranged," Clara said. "Yes," Mara said, "but you've been walking into rooms he arranged for 6 days. She held Clara's gaze. "The difference is now you know what you are when you walk in." Clara put her phone in her pocket. She looked at Adrian. He was watching her with those steady, unrevealing eyes, and she understood in that moment, with the particular clarity of things that have been building toward articulation for days, that he had been telling her the truth from the beginning about what loyalty meant, not agreement, not compliance, but the specific willingness to walk into whatever room she decided to walk into. "Can you get us back to New York by tonight?" she said to Mara. "The plane's already refueling," Mara said. "Then you're coming with us," Clara said. "You've been running parallel long enough." Something moved in Mara's face, not surprise. Deeper than that, the recognition of a specific kind of moment. "All right," she said. Clara looked at Adrian one more time. The cut above his eyebrow from the museum had scabbed cleanly, a dark line against his skin. He looked back at her without expression, which by now she understood was his version of complete attention. "Tonight," she said. "Tonight," he said. They were in the air by 2:15 local time. Below the plane, the city they were leaving diminished to a grid, and then to a smudge, and then to nothing, and Clara sat with the confirmation documents in her lap, and the Beaumont situation arranged in her mind with the clean geometric clarity of something that has been reduced to its essential shape. And she thought about a warehouse in Brooklyn and what waited inside it, and she thought about her mother's handwriting on the succession document and the line about power borrowed against a debt that always comes due, and she thought that tonight, one way or another, that debt was going to be collected. She looked out the window. The sky was the particular color of mid-afternoon above cloud cover, a white that wasn't quite white, a light that came from everywhere and nowhere. She felt her heartbeat, steady and deliberate, the rhythm of a woman who has stopped running from the shape of her own life and turned to face it directly. Her phone buzzed. Marco again. 2 words. Carver's there. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, opened them, looked at the clouds. The warehouse in Brooklyn was going to have a federal agent in it, and whatever Brandt had brought from Riga, and Dorian Voss with his silk robe and his bad bet, and Harlan Beaumont, who had spent 14 months building a trap and was now sitting inside it waiting for someone he thought he'd already beaten to walk through the door. She put her phone face down on the seat beside her and breathed and let the plane carry her back to the city that was hers. They landed at JFK at 9:47 in the evening, New York time, and the city came up at them through the descent the way it always did. Too bright, too dense, too certain of its own importance. And Clara looked at it through the oval window and felt none of the things she'd felt looking at it 6 days ago. 6 days ago it had been the place where she lived. Now it was the place she was responsible for, which was a different relationship entirely. Marco was on the tarmac. He had 2 other men with him she didn't recognize, which meant Adrian had made calls on the plane, which she'd expected. Mara came down the stairs behind her and stood in the jet wash and looked at the skyline with the expression of someone returning to a place they left long enough ago that the return requires a moment of adjustment. "How long since you were in New York?" Clara said. 11 years, Mara said. She didn't elaborate. She picked up her bag and moved toward the cars. In the first car, Clara, Adrian, Mara. In the second, Marco and the 2 men. They drove in convoy, BQE south toward Brooklyn, and the city moved around them in its nighttime register. The lights, the noise, the indifferent machinery of 10 million people doing whatever they were doing at 9:53 on a Thursday in a city that did not pause for anyone's private war. Adrian had the warehouse layout on his phone, sourced in the last 2 hours of the flight from a contact who had accessed the building's original permits and renovation records. The structure was a former textile facility in a Red Hook block 3 streets from where the other Ashmont facility had been hit 8 days ago, which Clara noted as deliberate, Beaumont choosing terrain he'd already demonstrated he could reach. The building had 2 main entry points, a loading dock on the south face, and a mezzanine level accessible by internal stairs. It was approximately 12,000 square feet of open floor with a central structural column array, the kind of interior that gave sight lines to anyone who knew to use them. "How many of his people?" Clara said. "Marco counted 4 vehicles when he drove past 2 hours ago," Adrian said. "Could be 8 to 12 people. Plus Brandt. Plus Carver." He paused. "Plus Beaumont himself, if he's there." "He's there," Mara said from the other seat, without looking up from the window. "Harlan doesn't send people to deliver his conclusions. He watches them delivered." She turned slightly. "It's his only real vanity. He needs to see the face." "Then we give him a face," Clara said, "just not the one he's expecting." The plan had been built in the last 3 hours of the flight, in the compact, unglamorous way that plans get built when time is short and the variables keep changing, stripped down to its essential moves, distributed so that no single failure point collapsed the whole structure, and calibrated around the specific fact that Beaumont's leverage, Voss, Cole, and whatever he thought he knew about the succession, had been neutralized without his knowledge. He was sitting in a warehouse with hostages he thought were valuable and a legal instrument he thought was pending, and neither of those things was true anymore, and he didn't know it. That gap, between what he knew and what was true, was the only weapon that mattered tonight. Marco's 2 men went to the south dock 20 minutes ahead. Mara took a 3rd position she'd identified from the permit records, a secondary access point that didn't appear on the standard building schematic, a legacy of an earlier renovation, which was the kind of detail that appeared in original permit filings and nowhere else. She'd found it herself on the flight, sitting with the documents with the focused attention of someone who had been doing this kind of work for 40 years and still did it better than the people who'd been trained to do it recently. Clara looked at her before they separated. If something goes wrong inside, nothing goes wrong inside, Mara said. Not now. She held Clara's gaze for a moment with those dark, information-dense eyes. Your mother came to see me in 2008, she said. You were 15. She came because she was starting to think about what she'd built and what would happen to it, and she wanted someone to tell her she'd made the right choice, keeping you out of it. She paused. I told her I couldn't say that. I told her the only person who could answer that question was you, and that you'd answer it when the time came. She looked at the warehouse, a block ahead. I'm glad I got to see the answer. She moved before Clara could respond. Clara watched her go, the compact, efficient movement, the way she didn't look back, and then turned to Adrian. He was looking at her. He'd been looking at her, she thought, for most of the last hour, in the careful way he did when there was something he was calculating and hadn't finished. Say it, she said. When we go in there, he said, Beaumont's people are going to respond to what I do, not to what you do. They know me. They know what I mean when I'm in a room. He paused. Which means your movements are less visible than mine. Which means you have options I don't. I know, she said. Clara. He said her name the way he'd said it once before. On the West Side Highway, the night he'd told her about the succession condition. Carefully, like something he was placing rather than dropping. If it comes to a direct moment, if there's a choice to be made about Beaumont specifically, it's my choice, she said, not yours. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Yes, he said, it is. Stay close, she said, and don't let Carver get to a phone. She walked toward the warehouse. The loading dock doors were open, which was not an invitation, and both of them knew it. Light came out through the gap. Work lighting, the kind that illuminates a space without warming it, the flat white brightness of old fluorescence in a high-ceilinged room. Clara went through first, Adrian 2 steps behind, and the warehouse opened up around her. The column array, the mezzanine above, the smell of cold concrete and something older underneath it, and the 7 people arranged in the space with the deliberate staging of a meeting that was designed to communicate something before a word was spoken. Voss was near the center, seated in a folding chair with the particular stillness of a man who has been sitting in one place for several hours and has run out of things to do with his fear. Cole was beside him, standing, with a quality of physical tension that told Clara he was less practiced at this than Voss, and more genuinely frightened. 2 men she didn't recognize flanked them. Brandt's people, she assumed, from their bearing, Eastern European and professional, and currently watching Adrian with the specific attention of people who know a threat by its posture. Stefan Brandt was near the east wall with a 3rd man, 50s, lean, with a stillness that was different from Voss's. Where Voss's stillness was exhaustion, Brandt's was practice, the composure of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a room and who had recently had reason to reconsider that assessment. Carver was near the stairs to the mezzanine. He'd changed since the museum. Different jacket, the same government employee wrongness to the fit. He was watching Clara with the calibrated attention of a man running a legal risk analysis in real time. Harlan Beaumont was at the far end of the floor, standing near the loading dock's inner wall, and he was exactly what Adrian's description had prepared her for, and also somehow more. The size of him, the particular physical authority of a large man who had spent 70 years having that authority confirmed. The way the room organized itself around his position without anyone appearing to choose it. He was looking at Clara with the expression she had not expected. Not contempt, not triumph, not the face of a man who has arranged something and is enjoying the arrangement. He was looking at her with genuine, unguarded curiosity. Clara Ashford, he said. His voice was deep and had the faint residue of an education that had cost significant money. Eleanor's daughter. He looked at her the way she imagined a naturalist looks at a species he's been tracking by its signs and is finally seeing directly. You look more like her than I expected. You knew my mother, Clara said. She kept her voice level, kept walking, slowly, toward the center of the room, which meant toward Voss and Cole, which was what she'd intended. She wanted Beaumont tracking her movement rather than Adrian's. We met 3 times, Beaumont said, in the late 80s before she left Europe. She was extraordinary, genuinely extraordinary. He paused. I regret that our interests didn't align more productively. Is that what this is? Clara said. Misaligned interests. This is a conversation about transition, Beaumont said. The Ashmont organization is a significant asset. Its legal structure is currently unclear. I'm in a position to offer resolution. Clara stopped walking. She was 12 feet from Voss and Cole. She could see Voss's hands on his knees, the slight tremor in the right one. She looked at Beaumont. The TRO, she said. Filed this morning, he said. Pending a ruling that will come within... Was denied at 8:48, Clara said. The room held it. Beaumont's expression didn't collapse. He was too controlled for that, but something in it shifted, a very small recalibration, the expression of a man whose model of the situation has just encountered data that doesn't fit. That's not possible, he said. The filing was complete. The filing was superseded by a confirmation of succession authority transmitted to Hendricks and Brawl at 7:41 this morning and simultaneously filed with the federal court's electronic record, Clara said. She reached into the document wallet she was carrying. She'd kept it through everything, through the flight and the tarmac and the walk across the block, and took out the stamped copy of the confirmation that Henk Brawl had pressed into her hands before they left. She held it up. Witnessed, notarized, time-stamped. The court had it before Reinhardt ruled. She paused. You have no instrument, Harlan. The legal play is done. Brandt moved first, not toward Clara, toward Carver, which told her that Brandt's primary concern in this moment was managing the federal liability and that Beaumont's people were already beginning to fragment along their individual interest lines. Carver took a step back from Brandt with the instinct of a man who wants distance between himself and the part of the problem that's going to generate the most exposure. Beaumont looked at the document in Clara's hand. He looked at her face. The curiosity was still there, reconfigured. You went to Mara, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Clara said. She confirmed the succession. Yes. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then something happened on his face that she hadn't expected and couldn't fully name. Not defeat, not exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has played a very long game and has arrived at its conclusion and is assessing the result with something closer to professional acknowledgement than personal devastation. Your mother built something more durable than I gave her credit for, he said. She built it to outlast you, Clara said. She just didn't live to see it. No, he said quietly. She didn't. He looked at the document in her hand. You understand this doesn't end cleanly. I have resources. Novian Partners is going to receive a complete file of your SEC interference by end of business tomorrow, Clara said. The documentation that Ethan Mercer used, the sealed compliance review, the chain of handling that leads back to your operational network. She paused. Carver's 6-year payment history is going to the Inspector General's office of the Financial Crimes Division, with a copy to the federal court that received his TRO filing. She paused again. And Stefan Brandt's communication records, specifically the Riga logistics chain and its connection to your Rotterdam playba, are going to the 3 regulatory bodies with jurisdiction over Beaumont Capital's European holdings. She held his gaze. You don't have resources after that. You have exposure. Brandt moved again, this time toward the exit, the loading dock, the open door, and the night outside it. He made it 4 steps. The sound came from the south dock. A door, a voice, and then Marco was in the room from that direction, and the 2 men Clara didn't know were flanking the exit, and Brandt stopped moving and stood with his hands slightly away from his body in the particular posture of a man who has assessed the geometry and found it unfavorable. Carver reached into his jacket. Adrian was already moving. Clara didn't see exactly what happened. It was too fast and the light in the room was wrong. But the result was that Carver's hand came back out of his jacket empty, and he was against the structural column with Adrian's forearm across his chest and his face carrying the expression of a man who has just had the speed of something demonstrated to him very directly. Adrian was breathing hard. The cut above his eyebrow, scabbed over, had not reopened. He looked at Carver with the flat, focused eyes and said nothing, which was more effective than anything he could have said. Beaumont's 2 flankmen looked at each other, looked at Marco, looked at Brandt, who had gone very still near the dock. Nobody moved. Beaumont looked at all of it. He looked at his people, positioned and contained, and at Clara at the center of the floor with the confirmation document in her hand, and at Adrian against the column, and at the open loading dock doors through which Mara walked now, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who has been waiting outside for the right moment and has decided the right moment has arrived. Beaumont looked at Mara. Something crossed his face that was the most human expression she had seen on it. "Mara Voss," he said. "Harlan," she said. "You've been running this from inside," he said. "Since the beginning," she said. "Since before you started." She stopped walking when she reached Claire's position and stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and the geometry of the room shifted one final time into its definitive configuration. Mara and Clara at the center, Adrian at the column, Marco and his people at the exits, and Harlan Beaumont at the far wall with nowhere productive to move and nothing left to deploy. He looked at Clara for a long moment. He looked at her with the curiosity still operating underneath everything else, the genuine intellectual interest of a man who can recognize when he's been beaten by something better than what he brought. "What happens now?" he said. "You sit down," Clara said, "and we talk about what your cooperation looks like." There was no single dramatic moment of capitulation. That was the part that nobody prepared you for. That the end of a thing like this was not a door slamming, but a slow exhalation, a series of small decisions that added up to a conclusion. Beaumont sat in a folding chair across from the one Voss had vacated, and Clara sat across from him, and they talked for 40 minutes in the cold warehouse with the fluorescents humming overhead, and Adrian standing near the column with Carver's phone in his jacket pocket, and Marco at the dock, and Mara near the wall, listening with the closed, careful expression of someone keeping a record. What Beaumont offered, a complete withdrawal from the Rotterdam matter, Brandt's full cooperation with the regulatory filings, and an agreement to terminate whatever remained of Carver's operational involvement before it generated further federal exposure for anyone. What he wanted, containment. Not freedom from consequence. He was too intelligent to ask for that. But a managed consequence, the difference between a man who goes down in a controlled fashion and a man who goes down publicly and takes everyone adjacent to him along. Clara listened. She did not agree or disagree during the 40 minutes. She asked 3 questions, each one precise, each one designed to confirm a specific element of what she needed. When she had what she needed, she stood up. "I'll be in contact through your attorney of record by end of business Friday," she said. "If the Rotterdam withdrawal and Brandt's cooperation aren't confirmed by that time, every document goes out simultaneously." She looked at him. "And Harlan, the Beaumont Capital Portfolio's connection to the Cressida Transit Network. That one I'm keeping. It doesn't go anywhere as long as the arrangement holds." She paused. "But it exists, and I know where it is." He looked at her. The curiosity had not left his face, even now. "Eleanor would have done it differently," he said. "Eleanor built it so I could do it this way," Clara said. "That was the whole point." She walked out through the loading dock into the night air, and it hit her the way cold air hits when you've been inside under bad lighting. Cleanly, completely, with the specific honesty of a temperature that doesn't have an agenda. The days that followed had a different texture from everything that had come before. Not easier. There was nothing easy about the architecture of what had to be rebuilt and restructured and in some cases simply acknowledged as broken, but cleaner. The Rotterdam withdrawal came through on Friday afternoon, confirmed by Hendricks and Brawl at 3:51, and Clara sat in the Cobble Hill building with the confirmation on the screen in front of her and felt nothing dramatic, which was the right response. It had been done. It was confirmed. The next thing was next. Carver resigned from the Financial Crimes Division on Monday morning. The resignation was attributed to personal reasons, which was the language used when the alternative was a filing that nobody wanted to make. Clara had the Inspector General documentation prepared and sitting in a secure location, and she would keep it there because a contained Carver was more useful than a publicly destroyed one, and because she had learned in the last 10 days that the most effective power was the power that didn't need to be fully exercised. Dorian Voss left the trust. He submitted a formal resignation on Tuesday, citing personal health reasons, and Clara accepted it without comment in writing and called him privately to say 3 sentences. That she understood he'd been frightened, that frightened people made decisions they couldn't sustain, and that she didn't hold him in contempt for it because contempt was a waste of organizational energy. He was quiet for a long time on the phone after that. Then he said, "Your mother would have been harder on me." And Clara said, "Probably, but I'm not my mother." She paused. "I'm something she built after." Cole stayed. He was useful, and his access to Brandt had produced 3 pieces of documentation that would outlast whatever Brandt's cooperation agreement currently promised, and frightened people who had been given a reason to be reliable were often more reliable than people who'd never been frightened at all. She watched him for the first month with the patient attention of someone who isn't looking for an excuse to remove a person, but who needs to know the person is where they claim to be. Petra Sandell was a more complicated case, and Clara gave it the time it deserved. Petra had run a compromise line, had made a unilateral decision to protect a source at significant operational risk, had withheld the communication request from Mara for 8 days. All of those things were true. Also true, the compromised line had been Mara's route to Clara in the first place, and Petra's protection of it, whatever her reasons, had kept it intact long enough to matter. Clara sat with Petra for 2 hours in the West Village townhouse on a Thursday afternoon and didn't assign blame, and didn't offer absolution, and mostly asked questions and listened to the answers, and at the end she said, "I need to be able to trust your judgment." And Petra said, "I need to be able to earn it." And they left it there, which was the only honest place to leave it. The Beaumont Capital situation resolved itself in ways that Clara had anticipated and some she hadn't. The regulatory filings that went out, the Novian documentation, Brandt's Riga connection, generated a review process that moved with the careful, deliberate speed of regulatory processes, which was to say slowly, which was fine, because slow and permanent was more useful than fast and reversible. Harlan Beaumont retained his attorneys and made his statements and presented himself with the composure of a man who had spent 50 years in rooms where composure was the primary currency, and he managed the dissent in the controlled fashion he'd negotiated for, which meant it took longer than Clara's instincts would have preferred, but landed in a place that could not be reversed. He would not be a problem again. She knew it the way she knew things now, not from data alone, but from the composite understanding of a person she'd been building since the moment she walked into that warehouse, the way he'd looked at her when she held up the confirmation document, the specific quality of a man meeting the limit of himself. Ethan Mercer was the part she'd expected to feel more about than she did. The Novian documentation, when it surfaced in the course of the Beaumont Capital Review, implicated him directly. The sealed compliance review, the document chain, the 6-month relationship with a firm under regulatory investigation that he'd been careful to keep off his official record. Delworth and Cross terminated him on a Wednesday. She found out from Adrian, who found out through the organization's financial intelligence network, which monitored the firm's personnel announcements as a matter of routine. He sent her the notification with no commentary, which was the right choice. She sat with it for a few minutes. She thought about the green dress in the bottom of the drawer. She thought about 5 years of early mornings and covered shifts and swallowed pride, about the hotel lobby and the rain and the 6 seconds she'd counted standing outside on the sidewalk. She thought about his face going white in the Grand Halloran Ballroom and about the way he'd looked at Celeste Beaumont's hand on his arm at the gala, the small proprietary ownership of it, and she thought that he had spent 5 years standing next to something real and had not known what it was, and that his ending was not something she had engineered so much as something that had always been waiting for him at the far end of his own choices. She did not feel triumph. She didn't feel grief either. She felt the clean, slightly exhausted clarity of someone who has set down a very heavy thing and has walked far enough away from it that she can finally see its actual dimensions. Celeste Beaumont. She thought about less than she expected. The Beaumont family's financial reversal was significant and public enough that the social structure Celeste had been moving through, the galas, the board memberships, the cultivated presence in the rooms that mattered, quietly reorganized itself around her absence, the way those structures do when the money that justified the presence is no longer performing. Claire had watched it happen to other people in her life, the subtle gravity of social capital, how it accumulated and how it withdrew. and she felt nothing particular about watching it happen to Celeste, except a mild clinical acknowledgement that the machinery worked consistently regardless of who was running through it. Harlan Beaumont was indicted by a federal grand jury in the 43rd day after the warehouse. The charges were financial in nature, regulatory fraud, obstruction, the kind of white-collar architecture that takes time to build and longer to prosecute, but that, when built carefully on the right foundation, tends to hold. He made bail and appeared at the arraignment in a suit that still cost significant money, and the photograph that ran in the financial press showed him on the courthouse steps with the composed expression of a man managing a narrative, and Clara looked at it once and put her phone down. The day the indictment came down, she was in the Amsterdam office at a desk that had been her mother's, working through the restructuring of the legitimate holdings with a thoroughness that she had come to understand was her particular gift. Not the dramatic gestures, not the warehouse confrontations, but the long, unglamorous work of understanding a system completely enough to change what needed changing without breaking what didn't. She had been there for 12 days. The canal outside the window was doing what canals do in November: gray, flat, patient. And the city had the muffled quality of a place that had been absorbing history for a very long time and had developed a specific relationship with impermanence. Mara was in the office down the hall, not a parallel operation anymore, integrated, which had required its own set of negotiations, its own careful structural decisions, the kind of conversations that took longer than anyone wanted because they needed to be gotten right. Mara had opinions, which Clara had expected, and they conflicted with Clara's in specific ways that turned out to be productive rather than corrosive, which Clara had not entirely expected but was glad for. Mara's 40 years of operational knowledge combined with Clara's instinct for system-level understanding produced decisions that neither of them would have arrived at separately, and Clara recognized that dynamic as something her mother had also understood and had embedded in the succession structure and had tried to give her. She thought about her mother often now, in ways she hadn't been able to in the years since Eleanor's death, because then there had been too much grief and not enough information, and grief without information has nowhere to put itself except inward. Now she had information, the succession documents, Mara's memories, the physical weight of the Amsterdam office, and the Rotterdam contract, and the organizational structure that Eleanor had built with the specific long-range vision of a woman who knew she was building something she wouldn't be present to see completed. The grief was still there, somewhere under everything, but it had been given context, and context made it possible to carry. On the 15th day in Amsterdam, Clara stood at the window in her mother's office and looked at the canal, and she thought about a phone call in the rain on West 54th Street, and about the woman who had put a number in her phone against the day she would need it, and she felt for the first time without complication something she recognized as gratitude. Not the easy kind, not relief wearing gratitude's name, but the hard-won kind that you only arrive at after you've gone through everything between the beginning and the understanding. Adrian found her there. He came in without knocking, which was how he did things now, the same way he'd moved to her left and slightly behind at the Grand Halloran Gala, the same way he'd put his arm across her shoulders in the museum alcove, not asking permission for the proximity, but not assuming it either, inhabiting a space that had been arrived at through 10 days of choices that neither of them had narrated while they were making them. He stood beside her at the window. He looked at the canal. "Voss," Dorian called, he said. He wanted to know if there was anything he could do. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd ask," he said. Clara considered it. "Tell him the Rotterdam renegotiation will need external consultation in the spring. If he wants to be useful, that's a place to start." She paused. "Keep it at arm's length for now." "Done," he said. He was quiet for a moment. The canal moved in its slow gray way. "How are you?" She thought about it honestly, which was something she'd become more practiced at in the last 2 weeks than she'd been in the previous 10 years. "I'm tired," she said, "and I'm not unhappy." She paused. "That's a better answer than I expected to have." He looked at her with those eyes, and she looked back, and the thing that passed between them was not dramatic, which was appropriate because the most substantial things between people rarely were. It had built in the spaces between the urgent things, in the 47-minute confirmation process, and the 2 hours in the car on the BQE, and the moment in the warehouse when he'd said it's my choice, and he'd said yes it is, and meant it fully. It had built the way most real things build, too slowly to track in the moment, visible only in retrospect, and durable in a way that the dramatic things were not. "The Rotterdam consultation," she said. "I want you in that room." "I'll be in the room," he said. She nodded, looked back at the canal. Below the window, a cyclist went by on the brick path along the water, and a pair of tourists stopped to photograph something she couldn't see from the angle, and the city continued its long, patient life around the edges of everything she was responsible for and everything she'd become. She was 31 years old. She had a graduate degree in library science, and she had an empire that stretched from this canal to a warehouse in Brooklyn to a shipping concern 200 kilometers west. She had a strategist who told her things she didn't want to hear and executed what she decided and had put his body between her and a bullet fragment in a museum alcove without being asked. She had a woman down the hall who had known her mother completely and had spent 14 months protecting the thing Eleanor had built so that Clara could find it when she needed it. She had a trust that was cleaner than it had been, and a legal structure that was settled in the way that things are settled when the right people have signed the right documents at the right time, and she had the particular authority that comes not from having it handed to you, but from having demonstrated in a compressed and brutal 10 days that you knew what to do with it. She had lost a man who had never been worth the 5 years she'd given him, and a life that had been smaller than she was, and a version of herself that had stood in the rain counting seconds on a sidewalk outside a hotel. She had not lost anything she needed. She understood that now completely, which was the kind of understanding that only arrives after enough time has passed for the full cost to be tabulated and the full gain to be weighed beside it. The canal went on being the canal. The city went on being the city. Clara Ashford stood at the window of her mother's office in Amsterdam and breathed, and the breath was even, and the hands at her sides were still. She had nothing left to prove. She had everything left to do. And she had learned, in the 10 days that had remade her, the critical difference between those two things. That the first was about other people's assessments, and the second was about the actual work. And that the actual work was where she had always, without knowing it, belonged. She turned from the window. She went back to the desk. She opened the file she'd been working on before Adrian came in, and she picked up where she'd left off, and the afternoon light moved across the canal outside and the office held its particular quiet, and Clara Ashford, heir of the Ashmont Syndicate, principal authority, her mother's daughter, worked.